but his friend was his father's hand and there was no logical reason why his father would let his hand go to serve his son. Without Jon at his side things had become more difficult. He had no insight into his father's mind and he had no way of sending messages to the other lords of the realm. There were ravens at Dragonstone of course, but any messages being sent would be watched by his father and would be intercepted. All his letters were written in code of course, but his father didn't need to understand what he had written. All he needed to know was that his son was sending coded messages to the other great lords. There were only so many conclusions that could be reached from that. The king was paranoid to be certain, too paranoid, but he did trust his hand at least for the moment. The hand was sworn to serve the king after all, and any messages he sent were only going to help the king in the long run after all, and Jon was a man of his word and he did serve his king, his true king. It wasn't perfect by any means of course. The spider and his little birds were everywhere in the Red Keep and he gladly whispered into his king's ear. When Rhaegar had first started to plan all of this, he had hoped that Varys might have been reasonable, might have come over to his side, but he knew that having the Master of Whispers in his corner would be too much to hope for. And so on Varys went loyally serving, telling the Mad King of all those who plotted against him. And of course Varys wasn't the only threat. Plenty of lords had spies in the Red Keep. After all, any one of them could betray their prince for a favor from their king. Although the king hated traitors, so the only favor they were likely to receive was their head being removed from their shoulders instead of being burned alive. There was a pounding in his head and Rhaegar realized that he felt so very weary all of a sudden. How was it fair that it had all fallen to him? Why had the gods, or fate or destiny, chosen him to do this? To complete the prophecy. Even now he could still remember when he read the passage in the dusty old book in the library. The book's name was forgotten to him now, but he could still remember the passage as clearly as though had just read it. 3 heads. Born amidst salt and smoke and beneath a bleeding star. To deliver all them from evil and end the longest night. For such a long time he thought that it had been himself that was to be the prince that was promised. His own vanity, he supposed, that had made him believe that. But it had shaped who he was, had made him put away his books and his scrolls and made him pick up the sword and mace and lance under the tutelage of good old Sir Willem d'Ary. But the prophecy had shaped his grandfather and father as well. His grandfather had married his daughter to his son because he believed that would bear the 3 heads of the dragon, and his father had taken his mother whenever he wanted because he believed that it was his duty to bring forth the prince. It had turned his father into a monster. If Rhaegar tried hard enough, he could almost remember the man that his father had been. Plenty of people had used to tell him that in his youth he had been a great deal like Rhaegar was now, but he couldn't be sure of that. That man was long gone, if he had ever existed, but in Rhaegar's youth he could remember his father as a man who had smiled at him, who had sat him on his knee as he sat on the Iron Throne. He even had the vaguest memories of his father singing to him, but perhaps that was only a dream. That father was dead, however, and Rhaegar had mourned him a very long time ago. He had been dead from the moment he had read about the prophecy. Perhaps it hadn't been the prophecy itself that had driven him to madness. It was Duskendale, everyone agreed, that had pushed his father into the embrace of madness, but the prophecy had been what had lain the seeds. And it has lain its seeds in me as well. Sometimes the prophecy is all I can think about. It had consumed him, he had been its vessel. Making sure that the savior of the world was born into it had left him no time for anything else. All of his dreams were about the prince and his sister. Aegon, Rhaenys and Visenya come again. Well, in truth not all of his dreams. Some had been filled with his new wife. She was beautiful, and while she did not enjoy it here, she had always had a smile for Rhaegar when she saw him, and the rare times he was able to spend time in her company she seemed to lighten Dragonstone. Her name as the Light of the West seemed to him well deserved. Dreams of her came into his head even when he shared his bed, and while he could not say that he loved her, he found that he was increasingly fond of her. Still other times he found that his dreams were full of Elia. He had always said that he had never loved her, but no one should be filling his dreams quite this much if he didn't feel something for her. He thought of the babe that would still be growing in her now. When she had told him that she was pregnant with her North Lord's child, he hadn't been able to stop the surge of fire that he had felt in himself at the thought of her carrying a babe that wasn't his. It had woken the dragon in him. In his dreams he had dreamed that it had been his child she was filled with. He had dreamed of singing a sweet song to the babe as it grew inside its mother, and then dreamed of the babe at its mother's breast. It had been a girl, he thought, but he couldn't be certain. She would have been Rhaenys come again. And still in other dreams it was Jon that came to him. He was still unsure on how to deal with those dreams and thoughts. They had always been rare, but they had never left. He found himself dreaming of those strong arms encircling him and Jon holding him against his chest. Jon was taller and broader than him, and Rhaegar had found that he had liked that. The prophecy. Cersei. Elia. Jon. His mother. His brother. Aegon. Rhaenys. Visenya. The long night. They were all that consumed his thoughts now. There had never been time for anything else. He knew nothing else. It wasn't such a long fall down to the waves. He probably wouldn't even realize he was falling until it was far too late to worry about it. The sheer shock of that thought brought him out of his mind like someone had slapped him before dumping a tub of ice water over his head. He shook his head and turned away from the balcony and walked back inside the small chamber and went over to the fireplace so that he might warm himself. He hated Dragonstone, he always had. This terrible place had never brought him any peace. It saddened him and filled his thoughts with darkness. Perhaps when all of this was over he would lock his father up here, lock him away in the top of the stone drum and let him rule over the painted table. He could be the king of that as much as he liked. He could burn it to ashes for all he truly cared. He closed his eyes and took 3 deep, slow breaths and ordered himself to calm down. He could not be selfish and fall apart. There was still so much more for him to do. So much more that had to be made ready. The most important thing was that he had to make sure that the promised prince would actually arrive. He had not been shy from Cersei's bed, and he found that he enjoyed staying there after the business of making babes was done. The bed had always been warm and Cersei would beg for him to stay. He would go to her bed tonight as well. He had not said anything to her as he did not wish to upset his new wife, but he had been concerned as of late. He had not been shy, and Cersei had always been eager for him to come into her bed, and she would often plead that he stay with her on the nights that he could not, but as of yet there had been no babe. Her moon blood had been coming as it should have been. He knew more than most how difficult the making of babes could be. He remembered how many times that his mother had lost a babe, bleeding them out or being born dead or dying while they were still just infants. If all of them had lived, then Rhaegar and Viserys would have more than enough brothers and sisters to fulfill the prophecy. But that was in a better world, and this world wasn't that one. But if Cersei couldn't give him the children he needed, then he would need another woman to bear them, and that meant that he would have to set her aside for another woman. That would not sit well with Tywin Lannister, and he needed Tywin on his side when he reached for the throne. He was the closest and most powerful ally that Rhaegar had. Not that he wouldn't need the other lords, but Rickard Stark and Doran Martell were too far away. Robert Baratheon had no true stake in this horse, and he wasn't sure where he would fall on the matter. Jon Arryn was something of an unknown as well. All he could be certain of was that he knew that Rickard, Doran and Jon were forming alliances. Mace Tyrell was loyal enough to his father. He was as ambitious as the rest of the great lords, but he knew that the Tyrells and the rest of the Reach were offended when it was announced that the king had betrothed Rhaegar to Elia, but the wound had been soothed a little when their engagement had been broken. Still, the Lord of Highgarden was left out of the loop, as Rhaegar couldn't be certain if he could trust him. Balon Greyjoy wasn't truly important enough to be of any help, and the Ironborn wouldn't be of any true military help at any rate. Rhaegar was planning on making this revolution as bloodless as possible, and the Ironborn weren't well known for being merciful. Most likely they would take advantage of any of the chaos that would naturally sprout up and launch raids. He would have to deal with them most likely when he was king. Rhaegar needed Tywin more than any other of the great lords, and he couldn't risk offending him. He could hope that he understood. After all, a king needed heirs, and if his daughter was incapable of giving them to him, then he would need a wife that could. He could offer to take another Lannister bride, but he got the feeling that wouldn't soothe Tywin Lannister's wounds. He wanted his daughter to be the queen after all. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place. For a brief moment he considered that maybe Cersei wasn't the problem, perhaps it was him. He knew that there were some men who couldn't sire a child, but he had never considered for a single moment that he might be one of them. He could ask Dragonstone's Maester to examine him, and maybe ask Cersei to submit to it as well. If it was proven that there was a problem, then he could send from potions from Essos, the free cities. He had heard that they had been able to help men and women who had such problems. Perhaps it wasn't even him who was to bring forth the prince. It occurred to him that it could be Viserys. It might not be either of them. Perhaps one of their sons would sire the prince instead. No, that couldn't be true. He had given so much to make sure that he would bring forth the prince, that the realm would be strong enough to face the long night and the others. It couldn't have all been for nothing. He had read all the signs right. He was sure that he had. He was going to be the father of the prince, of his sisters, and his name would be remembered forever. There could be no other outcome. He needed to get some fresh air, he needed to go. Roriger turned and made his way to the doors of the room and pulled them open and began to descend the spiral staircase outside. He descended all the way down until he was at the bottom of the tower and pushed upon the doors. The cold sea air bit at Roriger's hands and face and he had to close his eyes as the wind blew into his eyes. Was it any wonder that Dragonstone wore on his mood so? The island was as gloomy as the castle itself and its people were as cool as hard as their home. He felt sorry for whichever of his children would to inherit Dragonstone. Perhaps he would just grant it to a noble and faithful lord. He would hate to force this place on anyone, but someone had to have it, and he was rather a stranger have it than one of his children or someone he cared about. He walked along the castle walls, his arm held out in front of his face to block the cold wind. The gargoyles loomed out of the black shadows, the cruel faces of harpies and hellhounds stared out into the sea. The army of monsters had always unsettled him. He had a vague memory of hiding his face in his mother's skirts when he had first seen them staring down at him from the high walls of the fortress. On that first night he had dreamed that the stone statues would come to life and a harpy would land on his balcony and rip him from his bed and carry him away in the night, as the stone dragons would come to life and the castle crumbled to stones. He had awoken screaming and he had not been soothed until his mother came to him and sung him back to sleep. He was older and wiser now. The stone statues wouldn't be coming to life anytime soon, and Dragonstone wasn't actually made of dragons that had been turned to stone. The towers had simply been carved out of black stone. It was an incredible artistic achievement that Roriger could appreciate, but nothing more. He finally reached the door other side of the wall and pulled it open, and Roriger sighed as he was back in the warmth. That wasn't to say that the castle was very warm, but it was like standing in a fire compared to outside. Roriger resumed his journey through the castle until he finally reached his wife's chambers. Roriger had made sure that she was given the largest and warmest chamber that could be found aside from the Lord's chamber, and she seemed content enough inside it, although he knew that she would never truly be happy here. He pushed the door open and the first sight that greeted him was his wife sitting by the roaring fire in the heath, surrounded by her ladies. The fire made her golden hair shine and her eyes glow like the green flames that his father loved more than anything in the world. Perhaps it should worry him so that in that moment he could almost understand his father's fixation with the green flames. Being the princess of the Seven Kingdoms suited his new wife. She had not stopped wearing his colors even though she told him that she disliked how pale black made her look, but she did not wish to offend him by inverting the colors either. The fire caught the ruby that was set in her ring and her choker and made them glow with a pale red light. The emeralds in her hair sparkled in the light as well. She was beautiful. No more beautiful a maid had there ever been. No one could deny that. Her ladies were not well known to Roriger. It wasn't truly much of his business to know who his wife chose to surround herself with. All he did know was that most of them were from the Westerlands. In fact, he was certain that 2 of them were Lannisters through from a lesser branch of the family than the main one at Casterly Rock. However, 2 of the ladies were from the Reach and yet another was from the Riverlands. Cersei had not been gracious in describing them when she was lying next to him. She had told him that the girl from the Riverlands was named Jenna and that she was from an unimportant house that nobody cared about, and it had taken all of her father's influence just to get her to a position where she might serve the future queen. Cersei had said that she had half a mind to just dismiss her on the spot so she could go back crying to her father and bear his wrath at her failure. The girls from the Reach were distantly related to the Tyrells, which was not much of an achievement as half of that realm seemed to be related to the Tyrells. Again, his wife had made it clear that she didn't like them, and she even thought that they might be spying on her. While he was certainly glad that she was open to the possibility of there being spies in her midst if Roriger was going to be truthful, then he thought that she was simply being a little paranoid. She little good to say about her ladies from the Westerlands. She had little to say about any of them as a matter of fact. She simply told him how almost every single house had been competing to have one of their daughters serve as one of her ladies. They didn't want any influence with the crown, they wanted influence, as little as it might be, with her father. As she spoke of them all, Roriger was reminded of how cruel a person his wife could actually be. He had seen evidence of it before, there could be no doubt of that. He remembered how she had been interrogated by his father about why her father had been late for the tourney and why her mother had left the service of his mother. To take the attention of her, Cersei had thrown his mother into his father's sight, reminding him that she had been the one to dismiss her. That had not been something that Roriger had easily forgiven. Even during their wedding feast and 4 days afterwards he had been angry with her. He still had not truly forgiven her for it. He cleared his throat when it became apparent that none of them had noticed that he had come in. The ladies were deep in conversation and needlework. Well, the ladies around Circea were doing both of those things. Circea herself had a distant look on her face, and it was clear that she had long ago stopped listening to anything her ladies were actually saying. Her green eyes brightened when they landed on him, and she stood to greet him, as did the rest of her ladies, curtsying and smiling and giggling as they did so. "My love, how good of you to come and see us." Circea breathed, her golden hair falling in front of her face. "My ladies, might I have a moment alone with my wife?" In truth, Roriger didn't need to ask. All he had to do was say the word and they would leave the room in a storm, but it was a nice pretense that he was asking, and sometimes there had to be pretenses when you were ruling. All of the ladies nodded and curtsied again before they left the room. Roriger said a few words of farewell and a few niceties as well, such as he would love to visit Lady Jenna's family Holdfast and that one of the ladies of the Reach was utterly enchanting. When the door closed and he turned back to face Circea, he suddenly found his wife in his arms and her lips were pressed against his. Roriger could not stop himself from pulling her closer to himself. "You've no idea how much I've missed you. I swear I can feel my mind wasting away when I am trapped with them. I need to find more entertaining company." Circea gasped in between her kisses and gasps for air. Roriger desired her. He couldn't stop that, and he didn't want to. He wanted to rip her dress off and take her over a table, but he knew he couldn't do that. It wasn't befitting for a prince. "You should be kinder to them. I know you don't like them, but you're going to be the queen soon enough, and if word spreads that the queen is cruel to her ladies, then it would not look good on you, on us." Roriger pulled back and examined her. Her pale skin was alight with a red blush that made her look even more beautiful than she already was, and her eyes were lidded with desire. "I'm sorry, I never want to upset you. I can suffer them for you," Circea said sweetly, breathlessly, as though the mere act of pleasing him in anything brought her such pleasure that there were no words that could describe it. "You said that girl from the Reach was beautiful, enchanting. She isn't more pretty than me, is she? You think I am much more beautiful than her, don't you?" "Of course I do, and you know that you are as well." A simple truth that could not be ignored, though his wife always liked to be reminded that she was more beautiful than any other, and Roriger had found that it was best to indulge her in that, as she tended to grow cold if she ever thought that someone was more lovely than her. "I want you, my sweet prince. Please, please take me." He wanted to, by all the gods old and new he wanted to, and he needed to if there was ever going to be an heir. But there were things that demanded his attention. He may not enjoying ruling Dragonstone, but he was still its prince and the island would not rule itself. And so he gently took Circea's fingers and pressed a kiss to all of them gently. "I would, my lady wife, but things call on my attention, but I assure you that at the end of the night that I will return to you. You have my vow." That seemed to please her at least a little, but he was certain that staying with her would have pleased her better. Still there was too much to do, and so with a kiss pressed to her flushed cheek, Roriger turned and left the room. He had to speak with both the Castellan and the Master and the man-at-arms on top of it all. Dragonstone was separate from the Seven Kingdoms in terms of being apart, but it was still part of the realm, and there were still letters from all corners. It was also possible that letters had come from the Great Lords, and if that was true then he needed to know. His father would be watching for him sending letters, but letters arriving would with a bit of good fortune should be able to reach him unmolested. He needed word from Lord Ricard and Prince Doran. He knew that Elia, her husband, and her brother had managed to get out of the city. He had been there to see them off after all, but he wasn't certain what Elia had done with the letters he had given her. If he was Elia, then he would have given the letters to her brother and to her husband, as both of them were heading back to their homes, and they could have given the letters to the people they needed to go to. The only problem was that he was only assuming that was what Elia had done with the letters. She had been angry with him for involving her in this, for dragging her family into this matter. It was highly likely that she had just thrown them into a fire as soon as he had left the room. And even if she had agreed to send the message onward, he wasn't sure if Oberyn Martell and Ned Stark would pass it on. He didn't know them well enough. He knew that Oberyn didn't like him very much, and he had been against the union, though he had heard that he had been in a rage when he heard that Roriger's father had called off the engagement. Thought that was most likely because he thought that his beloved sister was being slighted and not because he had approved of the union in the first place. After meeting with the Castellan, Roriger had found that his dour mood had only gotten worse. The low folk of the island were never the happiest people, but it had been a harsh few moons and the mood was even grimmer than the weather. The people of Dragonstone were a hardy people, but there was only so much a person could endure before they wanted better. He doubted that they were going to revolt. They had suffered worse, but surely the only true worth of a lord was how happy the people he was supposed to protect were. The worst thing was there was truly little that he could do to make any of it better. They were at the mercy of the sea for most of their food, and the stores of Dragonstone had never been the most plentiful. He couldn't afford to throw them open and tell the men and women to eat their fill as much as he might like to. It occurred to him that he actually had not eaten today. He had slept longer than usual this morning, and when he had woken up he had found that he had wanted some time on his own. He had to fight a battle with Harlan Grandison so that he could be left on his own for a moment. It was good that it was him, as Lewin Martell and Oswell Went would not have surrendered so easily to him. It wasn't that Sir Grandison was a bad knight, it was just that he was an old man. He was the only member left of his grandfather's original Kingsguard, and he continued to serve his father when he took the throne, but he had been an old man even back then and he had not gotten any younger. Arthur had even told him that during meetings of the Kingsguard in the White Sword Tower the man had forgotten which king he was meant to be serving. Roriger knew the truth of that well enough. There had been more than one time when the old knight had thought that he was his father. He was respected by all the members of the Kingsguard and, strangely enough, by his father as well. That was perhaps the only reason that the king wasn't offended when he was called by his father's name. Still, despite that respect, his father had sent Grandison with him to guard him and his wife along with Oswell Went and Lewin Martell. If his father attempted to have him assassinated, then he supposed it made a certain sense to send Grandison with him, as it was unlikely he would be able to fight off a group of assassins. He wasn't certain why he chose to send Lewin and Oswell with him, though, as both were excellent swordsmen. If he had to guess, then he would assume that his father wanted Lewin gone because he feared for his own safety, as he often did now due to his paranoia. Sir Lewin had not taken well to the fact that his niece had been set aside by the king. He had only joined the Kingsguard under the pleas of his sister, as she had been planning to marry her daughter to Roriger for years. His irritation had only grown when the king had spoken ill of his late sister on the morning of the tourney. Arthur had told him that he had nearly broken his sword that night when he had turned it against a training dummy that night. Being sent to Dragonstone had done little to improve his mood, as he had been separated from his paramour. The fact that the Dornishman had a paramour was one of the worst kept secrets in King's Landing, but Sir Lewin had always been dutiful and had never let it interfere with his other vows, so it had been mostly overlooked. No one even knew who the paramour was, or even if they were a man or a woman, as Sir Lewin had always been where he was needed when he was needed. Of the three, the only one that Roriger couldn't understand why he was here was Sir Oswell Went. He was as loyal to the king as any Kingsguard should be and had always served well. Roriger had to imagine that it had just came down to who the king wanted around him the most. He was never going to send Arthur with him, as he was the best swordsman that his father had in his guard, and he knew how close he and Arthur was. Jonat Hordiary was his father's man through and through. He lived and breathed his vows. In that he was almost a perfect Kingsguard and was of no use to Roriger, and it made sense that his father would want him near. Barristan Selmy was loyal to the king as well and almost as great a warrior as Arthur, so that explained why his father kept him near, and Drold Hightower was the Lord Commander and his place was with his king. It seemed that Oswell Went had simply drawn the short straw in this matter. Not that the man had complained, of course, but none of the guards with him had volunteered to come with him. Roriger made his way to the kitchens and asked for some small fare to tide him over until dinner. A bowl of porridge that had been soaked in honey, 3 softly boiled eggs and a few slices of bread smeared with blackberry jam found their way into his stomach easily enough. He had hoped that a full stomach might make him feel better, but in truth all it had done was make his stomach stop complaining for the moment. He thanked the cooks for their work and stood from the stool that he had sat down on before turning to leave. Before he could, however, the door opened so suddenly that he thought for a moment that it would fly off of its hinges. Maester Acuin stood in the door, panting slightly, and it was clear from the sweat on his brow that he had been running to get here. Maester Acuin was not a young man by any means, but a life of constant word had left him as tough as a pair of old boots. He had been a farmer's youngest son in the Reach, near Old Town, and one day his father had saved up enough to send him to the citadel. He had been sneered on his entire time there, so he had told Roriger. But now that farmer's boy was a maester with chain forged from links of iron, black iron, red gold, yellow gold, silver, pewter, copper, lead, steel, and even 1 link of Valyrian steel. "My prince, they told me that you were here." After a few moments the wise Maester managed to regain his breath and stood to his full height, was almost half a foot taller than Roriger, his broad form almost completely filled the doorway. "The Castellan told me to come and find you. We have a small issue that has arisen. Lord Sunglass is here and is demanding to see you. I have to imagine that this is to do with the recent difficulties in King's Landing. He's waiting for you in the chamber of the painted table." Roriger sighed heavily and rubbed at his forehead with his fingertips to try and diminish the headache that was building. He knew that this was coming, but a part of him had naively hoped that it would never come up. That the pious Lord Sunglass would have just stayed where he was at Sweetport Sound, praying on what to do, but he knew that he wasn't that lucky. "We had better go and see to him then." In the end this might prove to be something of a blessing in disguise. Lord Sunglass wasn't truly a great lord, but he was well respected not just in the Crown lands but by the faith as well, so having him as an ally would be useful. The Maester nodded and began to lead him towards the stone drum. They reached the top of the stone drum and Lord Sunglass and the Castellan were waiting for them. Moonstones glimmered at Lord Guns's throat and wrists and fingers. The clear stones always looked strange when put against the Lord's red skin. Normally the red skin was caused by the fact that the fat lord had to climb many stairs, but now the redness was caused by the rage that the pious lord must be feeling. When Guns's eyes landed on Roriger, he had to admit that the sheer hate in his eyes made him hesitate. He knew that anger was not personally directed at him, at least he hoped that it wasn't, but it was still very much disturbing to see such anger in the pious man's eyes, as normally there had only ever been kindness in them. "My lord of House Sunglass, it is always wonderful to see you. It has been far too long. How may I be of service?" "My prince, forgive me, but I am not here to listen to pointless pleasantries. Your father had committed crimes against the gods. He has broken a marriage. It may not have been one conducted in the light of the seven, but it was a legal union nonetheless, and he is spitting on the power of the faith." With every word that fell from Lord Sunglass's lips, Roriger could hear the anger rising higher and higher, threatening to burst out and consume them all in a wave. That would be terrible enough, to shame the gods and the High Septon in this way, but he would not be content with that. "He has committed dicide, he has murdered the High Septon." The man screamed, his face now as red as a tomato as tears of rage and deep sorrow rolled down his cheeks. Roriger could say nothing in defense to this. There was nothing to defend it. The High Septon had not been a young man, but he had come to court to speak with his father all the same. He had made it clear that the faith would not stand with the king on this matter, as dissolving a marriage which had been consummated and had a child on the way was beyond anyone's power, and dissolving a marriage was a power that belonged only to the leader of the faith, even if the marriage was not conducted in the name of the faith. His father had not taken the holy man's words well, and his pyromancers were called and the court was summoned to watch as the High Septon, the god's avatar in this world, was tied to a stake and burned alive by his father's jade fire. The High Septon had begged and pleaded for his life, had beseeched the king in the name of the gods to change his mind, and when he was tied to the stake he had begged to the court to save him, lest they burn in the seven hells for all eternity. No one moved from where they stood as they watched the green flames lick at the bottom of the gold and white robes. No one wanted to draw the mad king's attention, so the noble lords and ladies bit their tongues, wiped away their tears and said their prayers under their breath. The High Septon, in fairness to him, had tried to be brave even as the fire sets his robes alight, praying to the father to judge him justly and the mother to have mercy. That was as far as he had gotten before his prayers had turned to screams, the Scab King looking down from the Iron Throne with what could only be joy in his eyes. When the fire had died down and all that was left of the god's chosen representative was jade cinders and a pile of ash, Roriger knew that he had to get himself and his wife and his mother and brother as far away from King's Landing as soon as possible. He had to wait for a few days to pass, as if he tried to leave for Dragonstone that day then his father would try and stop him from going and might have been offended, and offending the king now was not a good idea. If he could burn the High Septon to ashes, then Roriger being his son and heir would not be enough to protect him. After all, he still had Viserys. After 3 days had passed far too slowly and filled with barely hidden terror, he had approached his father. He had knelt before him and asked if he could take his wife to see Dragonstone. His father had been quiet and stared down at him, and Roriger had felt sweat break out across his skin, and it took all of his self-control to stop himself from swallowing around the knot that had formed in his throat. Perhaps the gods had been smiling down him instead of the High Septon, since his father had scoffed and said that he had his leave to go. A part of him knew that he should not have pushed his luck, but he had to at least try, so he had asked if he could take his mother and brother with him. His father had not taken it well. He had screamed and ranted, and for a few long moments Roriger thought that he was dead. That he was going to summon his pyromancers and the court, and he was going to be burned like so many before him. It would certainly set an example if burning the High Septon had done. Do not anger the king, as even being born from his body would not save you from his wrath. But as soon as the storm had come it had passed, and his father simply said that his wife and his son belonged with him and with him they would stay, and just like that Roriger was dismissed from his father's presence and Roriger returned to his wife's side, telling her they were leaving in the morning and that he would make certain that the ship was arranged. Is it true that he means to name one of the pyromancers as the High Septon? He cannot do that. Lord Sunglass's ranting had brought Roriger out of his memory and he focused all his attention back onto him. The High Septon must be chosen by the most devout. The king cannot appoint his own High Septon, and he must be a member of the faith. The king forgets himself. Roriger was half tempted to remind the man that Bela the Blessed disregarded the most devout and named his own High Septons, but that was a hole that he didn't want to dig for himself at the moment. Bela was well loved by the faith and the small folk, and he could have chosen a cow to be the High Septon and the faith most likely would have accepted it. Regardless, he didn't wish to anger Lord Sunglass at the moment, and stating that fact most likely would have led to an argument, and besides, it wasn't as if Roriger disagreed. Roriger turned to the Castellan and the Maester and dismissed them both, although it was clear to him that both of them seemed to be uncertain about leaving their prince alone with a man who was clearly half mad with rage. Roriger insisted that they leave, and he was glad that he did not have to make it an order. Regardless, they had nothing to be concerned about, as Roriger was a more than capable warrior, and even if he wasn't, Lord Sunglass was hardly much of a threat, and despite how angry he was, even he knew better than to attack a prince of the realm. Once both men had left them alone at the top of the stone drum, Roriger turned to face the man. Lord Sunglass, forgive me for being the one to tell this to you, but I think given what my father has done recently, I think we can both agree that he doesn't much care about what he cannot do anymore. It seems to me that he has decided that the king is the ultimate authority in the land now. After all, who will defy him? He has shown that he is more than willing to burn people alive no matter what their station, and it's not easy to defy a king even when they are of stable mind. So, I ask you, what should I do? What can I do? He couldn't be direct and say it. He couldn't, because even thinking of dethroning a king was treason, and kinslaying was the worst sin imaginable, even worse than kinslaying. Of course Roriger had never planned on killing his father anyway, simply depose him and lock him away, but Lord Sunglass wouldn't know that, and if he thought that Roriger was planning on killing him to take the throne, then he could run off and spread the word and everything would be ruined, and he could not allow that to happen. He had to let Lord Sunglass come to the same conclusion that he had and make him think that he had convinced Roriger to move against his father and not the other way around. The man was clearly deep in thought, and that struck Roriger as a good sign. After a few moments the man let out a heavy sigh. My prince, in all the years that my house had been sworn to Dragonstone, I had never known a better ruler than you. You are a good and just man, I am certain of that. You must surely not agree with the terrible crimes that your father has been committing. Of course not, my lord. I was married to my wife in the light of the Seven and by the High Septon. My belief in the gods is as strong as your own, and I am their humble servant in all things, and the High Septon has been in my prayers every night since my father murdered him. In truth, Roriger had never had much faith in the gods. They said that the mother loved all, but that didn't stop them from dying. They said that the father judged all justly, but it didn't stop evil men from ruling over good men. If any of the gods were real and had any power, then it would have to be the stranger. Plenty of people died every day after all. But that was not what Lord Sunglass wanted or needed to hear. He wanted Roriger to be the pious son who loved his father and his king, but loved the Seven oh so much more, and Roriger was more than happy to play that role if it got him what he needed. I know that you do, and I know that you would. The High Septon is always in my prayers, and he is always in my thoughts. If ever a man deserved to rest in the greatest of the seven heavens, then it is he. Still, his death is a tragedy and a crime, and it must be answered for. Lord Sunglass let out a heavy sigh, as if even thinking the words were hurting him, and they probably were. My prince, forgive me for saying this, and know that I will pray to the Father above that he will forgive me as well, but something must be done. And there it was. Roriger quickly adopted an expression that was equal parts troubled, shocked and saddened. My Lord of Sunglass, if you are suggesting what I think that you are suggesting, no, I cannot do such a thing. Whatever else he is still my father. I love him. To do what you suggest, I would commit kin and kinslaying. I would be cursed. I cannot do such a terrible thing. Your Grace, I know that it is hard to hear. It is harder for me to say, he is my king and I swore to serve my king and always be faithful to him. But I also swore to be faithful to the gods. I read the seven-pointed star every day and swear to live my life by its teachings and love the gods in everything that I do. Your father has made doing both of these things impossible to do. Something has to be done. Roriger turned and walked over to one of the chamber's long windows and looked out onto the horizon. Lord Sunglass most likely thought it was to hide his tears or to get some air so that he might think on what to make of all of this, but in truth it was simply to hide his expression of utter disbelief at how well this was going. Perhaps you are right, things cannot continue as they are. He turned and walked back over to the large table and looked down onto it. From where he was standing he could look straight down on King's Landing. Well, he could look at where King's Landing should be, as when the table was made King's Landing had not been there. But perhaps he does not have to die, if we could simply depose him as king and we could lock him away so that he could cause no harm. An excellent suggestion, my prince. He can be sent to a convent where he can pray and repent for the rest of his days. It wasn't exactly what Roriger had planned, but if worst came to worst then anything would do so long as he was out of the way. In truth it might actually be a better idea, as making certain that his father was away from any true power was probably for the better, though he had to admit that he would feel sorry for the brothers who would be forced to bear his father for the rest of his days. I must think some more on this, Lord Sunglass. It is not an easy thing that you have asked me to consider. May I offer you the comforts of my halls for the night? The sailors say that there may be a storm and I do not wish for you to be taken at sea. There was some truth in that. The waters around Dragonstone were difficult at best, but when there was a storm brewing it was nearly impossible to leave. Lord Sunglass accepted his invitation with all the grace that a lord should have, but before he left Roriger asked him that he not send any ravens or mention anything of this conversation to anyone. After all, anyone could speak out and inform the king rather than face his wrath. The pious lord said that he understood and left the chamber, and as soon as the door was shut Roriger let out a heavy sigh and rested against the painted table. He was exhausted, but this was perhaps for the best. Lord Sunglass was something of an ally now, even though he would more than likely have an overblown sense of self-importance about his role. Still, every ally was helpful in some small ways, and Sunglass had some useful relations that come in handy. If he was correct, then Tanda Stokeworth was a relation to Sunglass, and with how close Castle Stokeworth was to King's Landing that had its uses. Roriger looked down at the painted table and brought his fingers across its colored surface. He wondered if this was how Egon the Conqueror felt all those years ago on the eve of his invasion, when the 7 kingdoms were still just 7 kingdoms. When Roriger was done, this table may have to be chopped up for firewood and a new one made, as the entire thing could look completely different if everything got out of hand, which it occurred to him that it might, since all his plans hinged on everything going perfectly, and when did they ever do that? His head was pounding and he found that everything else could wait until later. No matter what else he was uncertain about, he was certain of one thing. Most of the 7 kingdoms would still be there in the morning. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32. The snow fell softly outside and Ashura watched as it fell to the ground with a sad smile. The snow was beautiful, and the way it gently covered the roofs of Winterfell's towers made the ancient castle seem even more beautiful and mysterious than it was normally. Ever since she had come north with Elia she had been surprised by how often it snowed. It was the time for it, of course, but it made her long for spring. Of course, she had heard that it snowed in the north even when it was summer, but the winter was almost unbearable, even as it cast them into a beautiful and silent world. You would never be able to tell that there was such unease and sadness and anger inside the ancient castle. Ashura stood with a sigh and wrapped the blanket tightly around herself and shut the window's shutters. Ashura's room had some of the piping that carried the hot water of the springs up and around the great castle, but it still wasn't one of the hottest rooms, and on cold days it made little difference, so she had taken to keeping her blanket wrapped around her even when in her thickest furs. She was Dornish. It never snowed in Dorne and she wasn't used to it. She had seen snow before, of course. Once she and Arthur had gone to the Vale with their older brother to meet old Lord Jon Arryn. Ashura wasn't so blind as to not know why they hadn't gone. You didn't just pass that amount of distance without some reason behind it. It was about a betrothal. Ashura still didn't quite know the full details of the possible match, but she had to assume she was going to marry either the old lord, or more likely his heir, his young nephew Elbereth Arryn. Lord Arryn and his nephew had both been very kind to her. The nephew was quite a skilled knight and was not unbearable to look upon, and while Lord Arryn was certainly an old man, it was clear to look at him that he had been a handsome man in his youth. She had dinner with the both of them together and found them both to be pleasant enough men, and the Eyrie was a very pleasant castle, even through going up and down the mountain might kill her just from the fear of it. She could have been quite content there with either of the Arryn men as her husband, but she did not wish to be content. She wanted to be happy. Besides, the Vale was not dawn, and she certainly got the feeling that neither of them would want her to bring her bastard daughter with her, and she would never leave Lauren, not for anything in this world. Thankfully, her older brothers were not such fools as to make her try and do something that she did not want to do, and so her eldest brother had firmly but respectfully had told them that no marriage would come of this the night before they had left to go back to Dorne. When she had finally returned to Dorne, she had only stayed a few days with Lauren until she was sent to King's Landing to serve the Queen until Prince Doran had summoned her back. When he had told her that he was sending her north with Elia, and that he wanted her to take Lauren with her, she wasn't sure what to think. She couldn't deny him. He was her prince and she was a Dornish woman, but taking Lauren with her meant that Brandon would see her. She never wanted Brandon to see the girl, he had no claim to her. She remembered the night he had helped create her well enough. It had been a night that she had quite a few fond memories of, but those memories had been soured when she realized that she was with child. Not because she resented her daughter in any way, she had loved her from the moment she had held her in her arms and knew that she was utterly perfect. Ashura would have changed nothing about her. No, what soiled the memories of that night was the fact that her daughter would never get to know her father. She had never intended for a child to be created that night. Ashura was no fool as to be taken in by a charming man's words, but Brandon Stark was one of the most handsome men she had ever looked upon, and he could actually be quite charming when he wanted to be, and he wanted to be when he thought that he had a chance of having her in his bed for the night. Ashura wasn't a fool. She knew how beautiful she was and that plenty of men wanted to boast that they had the Maid of Starfall in their bed. Perhaps a tiny part of her had wanted to brag that she had the Wild Wolf of Winterfell in her bed. It had been at a small feast that had been held at Castle Stokeworth. Lady Tanda Stokeworth was trying to find a match for her younger daughter Lollys. She was a pretty girl from what Ashura could remember, but she had been a little overweight and she was lacking in wits, though she was a sweet girl with a gentle heart, and the way she had smiled when she saw all the people who had come to see her, then it made up for any shortcomings. That sheer joy had made her the most beautiful girl in the world. Ashura liked her more than she did her older sister, Felice, at any rate. An unpleasant woman who resembled a fish and who sneered at those she thought were below her and pleaded for the attention and favor of those she knew was above her. Her husband wasn't much better, a sour knight whose name that Ashura couldn't remember on the top of her head. Ashura had still been serving the Queen at that point, and she had been invited by Lady Tanda to attend the feast, so Ashura had attended with her along with two of her other ladies. She had tried to keep her head down as she didn't want to steal any attention away from Lollys, but when someone had come to speak with her it wasn't as if she could ignore them, so she had locked up to meet eyes with the Wild Wolf himself. She had met Brandon before that night, although met was perhaps a generous way of putting it, at some tourney or other, so she knew who he was, so she didn't understand why the heir to Winterfell was attending a feast in honor of the second-born daughter of a house sworn to King's Landing. He couldn't seriously be considering taking Lollys Stokeworth for a wife. Not that the poor girl didn't deserve a good match to be certain, but Brandon was going to be the Lord Paramount of the North one day and more than likely would be the Warden of the North as well. It was a match that would certainly make Lady Tanda happy, but she couldn't understand why Lord Brandon's father would want his son to marry a lady from House Stokeworth. They weren't a particularly old or powerful family, nor did they have a great deal of money. There was no reason why House Stokeworth would be of any benefit to House Stark, so there was no reason for them to be wed, and as much as she hated to admit it, she doubted that poor Lollys was quite Lord Brandon's favorite sort to conquer, so she doubted that lust was the reason he was here. Still, it wasn't as if she could ask him what he had been doing there, as she didn't have a right to know anyway. Brandon had asked if he could have her for a dance, and Ashura would have said yes, but as a lady in service to a queen she couldn't say yes to him on her own. Thankfully Queen Rollo was kind and understanding and allowed her to share a dance with Brandon. The one dance soon turned into two, and those two soon turned into five, and she soon found herself sitting at Brandon's table and drinking with him, enjoying his company far more than she thought she would. She knew that it wasn't suitable for a queen's lady to be sitting with a man that she wasn't married to, but Queen Rollo hadn't seemed to mind, as she had been too busy talking with Lady Tanda about something or other to pay much attention to what her ladies or handmaidens were doing. The feast had been going on long into the night, and Lady Tanda was a generous host, and willing to do anything to impress her queen, and she had been keeping the wine flowing and the food plentiful. Plenty of men and women were deep in their cups that night, and she was certain, looking back, that plenty of bastards had been made that night. She just hadn't thought that at the time that she would be one of the ladies walking away with an interesting new addition to her family, but she had found herself unable to pull herself away from Brandon Stark. As time passed and more lords and ladies left the hall to go to their rooms for the night, Brandon had decided that it was time for him to retire, but as he stood to his full height he held his hand out for her to take. A part of her knew then and there that she should have refused him. She had been too familiar with him as it was, but as she looked at the high table where the Queen was engrossed in conversation with another of her ladies, then turning to speak with Lady Tanda, and thinking on just how long it had been since she had been able to partake in this pleasure, it had all been too much, and she took his hand. The next memories were hazy, and Ashura wasn't certain if that was to do with the pleasure she had felt or do the wine she had drunk. What she did know was that from what she could remember, it was one of the most pleasurable nights that Ashura could remember. She could remember Brandon freeing her from her dress and taking off his silk shirt and breeches, watching as the light of the fire play across the muscles of his chest. The sight caused her mouth to water far more than the strawberries and cream they had for dessert. It had certainly not been the greatest pleasure she had. She was certain that Dornishmen remained the most supreme lovers in all the land, but Brandon had a stamina that she had enjoyed. He seemed unable to get enough of her. They laid together after they had finished, the light of the fire warming them and Brandon's strong arms holding her tight to his chest. She had been surprised by how gentle the Northman had been, not just during the act but after it as well. As much as she would have liked to stay, she knew that she couldn't. She was certain that Queen Rella would understand, but it would be for the best if she was back before anyone noticed that she was gone. She slipped out of Brandon's hold and quickly pulled her dress back on. She had been lucky as she had managed not to disturb him as she finished dressing and slipped out of the room. She returned to the hall only to find it empty, save for a few servants who had decided to get ahead of the cleaning for tomorrow and to sneak a few choice morsels off of the plates that the lords and ladies had left. She had left them to it and made her way to the chambers which had been given to the Queen to sleep in. She walked in just in time to see that the Queen was sitting in front of the mirror. One of her favorite handmaidens was freeing her hair from her braids, and the Queen did not turn to look at her, simply gazed at Ashura's reflection in the mirror. "You did nothing to shame me, I trust, yes Ashura? A queen surrounds herself with ladies, not whores." The disapproval in the Queen's tone both hurt and surprised, but she simply nodded and her Queen dismissed her to go to her room. She knew that she shouldn't have been surprised looking back on it, as at the time she had still been clinging to the idea that the rest of the kingdoms were like Dorne, but of course they weren't, and only looking back had she realized how foolish she had been. She could have been dismissed right there and then. Still, when she woke in the morning and went to break her fast with her Queen and her other ladies, the Queen had smiled at her warmly as if nothing had ever happened. Ashura did not see Brandon again that day or the next, or on the day that the Queen finally decided that it was time to return to King's Landing, even as she was clearly dreading it. The king had not been pleased to see his wife again. He barely seemed to notice her at the best of times. At the worst of times he was glad to see her. It meant that he could have his fun with her and no one would even try to stop her, not even his Kingsguard, who were sworn to protect her as their queen and sworn by their vows as knights to protect women. It did not sit well with her that Arthur, her own dear brother, was part of that. The thought of him, her gallant and favorite brother who taught her how to dance and would twist flowers to make her a crown for her hair when she had been little, would stand by and listen as the Queen was raped and hurt by her own husband, made bile burn at her throat. She knew that he couldn't do anything, of course. He had sworn oaths to his king, to serve him and protect him above any other. He could not disobey him, or harm him or kill him, for that would make him an oath-breaker, a kingslayer, and there was no one more accursed in all the world, even though that even back then she thought that if any kind deserved a sword being shoved into his back, then it was the Scab King. For the months that had followed she kept the Queen's company and everything seemed fine until one day she woke and her stomach had been in disagreement with her and she had emptied what had been left of her dinner from the previous night into the chamber pot. She had never been with child before, but she had seen when her mother was pregnant with her younger sister and she knew the signs well enough. If she had half the sense the gods had given a pig, then she would have brewed some moon tea and have done with it, but she hadn't done that. She didn't want to do that. As she had stared down into her chamber pot with the taste of bile still on her lips, her thoughts had turned back to her own childhood. She had thought of Elia and herself when they had both been girls in the water gardens, splashing and swimming in the pools and running down the pale pink stone. Elia had not often been allowed to play due to how frail she was as a child, but Ashura had always stayed close to her, and when she was allowed to play it was the most fun that Ashura had ever had, aside from when she played with Arthur. As they had grown up together they had spoken about who they hoped to marry. Ashura had whispered into her ear that she would not mind marrying Oberyn, as then she and Elia would truly be sisters then. Elia had laughed at her and told her they were already sisters, and then she pushed her into a pool. They had also spoke of how when they had their own children about how they would play in the water gardens just as they did. She had known that it was foolish. Elia had no children and she was not even married at the time, though whispers had been going around the Red Keep as they always did that with the late Lord and Lady Baratheon having failed in their mission to find a Valyrian bride for their prince, the king was growing more restless and might settle for betrothing his son to Elia due to the Valyrian blood present in House Martell. The words had made Ashura angry when she had heard them. It still made her angry to think on them even now. No man would settle for a princess of Dorne, no man would settle for Elia. They would be blessed by the gods to have her. Regardless, she would have children soon enough, and Ashura wanted their children to be as close as siblings. This would be the first child to do so, and she was not shamed that she was with child. It was the people in the Red Keep who would shame. Her brothers would not turn their backs on her. Arthur had always been her champion, her defender. Like Elia and Oberyn, there was only a year between, and while Arnold might sneer and grumble and even yell at her, he would not forbid her from his halls, nor any child of her body, and he would ask no questions, which was good, as if he did ask and he learned of Brandon then it could end in blood. So many forget that the Danes were Dornish due to their Andal blood which made their skin light, but they were still Dornishmen, and a Dornishman's temper was a terrible thing. She had gone to the Queen that morning and asked if she might be allowed leave to go and visit her family, for close to a year. The Queen had been silent, and she was certain that her ladies and handmaidens had simply the best time gossiping behind her back, but she didn't care a whit for them, not one whit about what they thought of her. The Queen had given her leave to go, but made certain that Ashura swore that she would not return until a year had passed, and she would return alone. It wasn't the most subtle of warnings, but Ashura had heeded it all the same. Within a fortnight her trunks were packed and she was back on her way to Starfall. Arthur, who had been given leave by the king to return for Starfall for a few weeks, although he would be returning 2 days after she had arrived, had greeted her with a hug and a kiss to both her cheeks. Arnold had been colder, but he had always been that way for as long as she could remember. Ever since Ashura had been born, her elder brother had been the young lord, the lord in training, ready to take over for their father. It saddened her to be certain, but at times it was hard to even think of him as a brother. Still, he had a kiss for her. Illyria greeted her warmly enough, but they had never been very close to one another, it saddened her to say. Elia had beaten the poor girl to the punch at being her sister, and when Ashura thought of her sister, Elia would always be the face that came to her mind before any other. Her father was dead long before she had left to serve the Queen, and her mother had never truly left her grief, though Ashura had spied a smile on her face when she had seen that her eldest daughter had returned home. Ashura had decided that she would tell them all the night she returned. At dinner, Arthur would be returning to King's Landing, and it was better to do it while he was still there. Arthur would always support her in everything. They had just started on the first course, a stew made from meat of 7 different snakes, which was thickened with onions and carrots and seasoned with black pepper and a few drops of venom, with circles of thin bread, dripping in oil made from olives, served alongside. When she had told them, she was certain, looking back, that not even Winterfell covered in snow had been as silent as the small dining room of Starfall. Arnold's spoon was held in his frozen gasp as it hovered before his mouth. Arthur stared at her as if she had suddenly grown 2 heads and announced to all of them that she planned to join the Silent Sisters. Illyria clearly did not know how to react, and her poor mother had finally showed an emotion that was not sorrow for the passing of her late husband, rage. The silence had not lasted long, and soon the small dining room was filled, screaming, swearing and stupidity. Pleas had flown as easily as threats and warnings had done, and at the end of the night Ashura had stormed out of the small room and locked herself into her old bedchambers. Perhaps at the time she had thought that it would be too easy, but it didn't matter. She would not be rid of the child, and nothing any of them said would convince her. She had penned a few letters to Elia, but knew that she would not be able to send them that night. Morning had finally come, as it was wont to do, and her family had calmed themselves. Arthur had been shocked from her news, but now that he had slept on it and could see it with a clear head, he was on her side, sitting next to her at breakfast and making his side in the argument known. Ashura was glad that she had not misjudged her brother, because at that moment it seemed like he had been the only ally she had. Her mother disapproved, as she was always wont to do. Her mother was not Dornish and was the daughter of a lord from the Westerlands, Despite all the years she had spent here, she did still not understand Dawn. Arnold made his disapproval known by simply staying silent and not speaking to her. Illyria might not have disapproved herself, but with her eldest brother and mother against her sister, it was not as if there was anything that she could do or say, and so her little sister had simply bit her tongue. 2 days had passed too quickly, and on the eve before Arthur was due to depart, Ashura had sent her letters to Illyria, begging her to come and help her. She had seen the 2 ravens she had attached her messages to fly over the mountains, one towards Sunspear and another towards the water gardens, as at the time she had no idea where Illyria would be. When Arthur departed, she had cried harder than she had ever done before in her entire life, although she truly did not want to. She wanted to be strong for him and show that her mother and brother's coldness did not bother her, but her resolve had failed her, and she had sobbed into his shoulder as he wrapped his arms around her back and held her close to him, making her feel as safe as he always did. When Arthur finally did leave, she had been expecting the worst. At the time she wasn't entirely sure what the worst was, but she knew that whatever happened it would not be good. But perhaps Arthur had spoken to them, or they both had spent the time calming down, as now, at the very least, they were speaking to her again, and while it did not stop her tears, it did allow her some composure. Her mother had even held her tight to her and smoothed down her hair, kissing her forehead as she did so. Still, she could not take those letters back now, and within a few weeks Illyria and Oberyn had both descended onto Starfall with at least 100 men. The anger that her brother and mother had forgotten was soon back at full force. She managed to smooth things over somewhat, and soon Illyria was attending to her, saying she would stay at Starfall until the babe was born. The days had passed quicker than she had expected, and soon her screams had filled the air and the babe was coming. There had to be no pain like it in the entire world, and for a moment she truly had thought that she had been splitting apart at the seams, and she truly thought that she was going to die, in a bed that would be stained with her blood. She remembered thinking that if she did die, then at the very least she had returned to Starfall. If she did, then she had always hoped that would die here surrounded by her family. But all the pain was soon forgotten as a squalling babe with bright grey eyes was placed in her arms, looking up at her. Ashura had never believed that loving someone the moment that you saw them was possible, but she knew at that moment that it was, as her Violet looked down into her daughter's grey ones. She was the most beautiful thing that she had ever seen in her entire life. Illyria had said that she would grow to be just as beautiful as she was, but Ashura knew that she would grow to be even more beautiful. She spent every moment of time that she could with her babe, her sweet little Lauren, but before too long it was time to head back to King's Landing, even though she truly did not wish to. She had wanted to take Lauren with her, but she knew she couldn't. The Queen was not unkind, but she would never allow her to keep Lauren with her in King's Landing. She had sent one of her own ladies away before, her best friend, and she would do the same to Ashura. Ashura had cried as she kissed Lauren goodbye before placing her in her grandmother's arms, promising to write to her as often as she was able. She turned then and walked over to the small wheelhouse, know that if she looked back that she would never leave. The Queen welcomed her back warmly, but she would say nothing of Ashura's absence or the reason for it, nor would she tolerate it as a topic for discussion. Things almost seemed to return to normal. All that was different was that now she would write a letter to send to her daughter and then would wait for a response. Of course it was not Lauren, but her mother who had been writing the letters to her, telling her of how well she had been growing and how much she loved her, and so Ashura kept on sending the letters, and for a time she had gained a sense of normality. Until her brother had summoned her home and her prince had given her a command. With a sigh and a shake of her head, Ashura brought herself out of her memories. She could not but slip into them as of late, as they tended to provide her with more pleasant company. Illyria was gone from here, a captive at Casterly Rock, to hear Ned tell the tale at the Mad King's decree, and Ashura could not go to her even though she was sworn to serve her. The Lord of Winterfell said that he did not want to give the Lannisters any more hostages, but Ashura did not care a whit about that. All she cared about in that moment was Illyria, who was trapped all on her own with not a friend in sight. She needed to see Lauren. Her babe never failed to cheer, even though she was perhaps a little too big now to truly be called a babe anymore, even if she would always be here baby. Ashura turned to face the door to her chambers and made her way over to them, keeping a tight grip on her blanket so that it would not fall and cause her to trip up. Winterfell was as silent inside its walls as it was outside as well. A grim mood had fallen on everyone inside the ancient castle, and nothing could seem to be done to cheer any of them. It did not help that simply days ago the castle had been thrumming with life as thousands and thousands of men had come, answering their lord's summons. Every night there had been great feasts and proud declarations and boastings of great victories that would be won if it came to war, and how they would get their lord's son's wife back where she belonged. but almost as soon as they had arrived they all had to march back home. Dark fat clouds had been spotted on the horizon, and if they were still here when the snows came, then they would not be marching home for weeks, maybe even months. Lord Ricard had given his bannermen leave to go. He didn't want them to freeze outside in the cold, and there wasn't enough food in the stores to feed them all. Ashura hoped that they had all made it back to their homes before the clouds had opened. She couldn't imagine having to march in this cold. The halls of Winterfell were abandoned, with only the odd servant here or there. Ashura did not stop to speak with them, as they would most likely be busy with some task or other, and her only want at the moment was to reach the nursery. She turned the corner at the end of the hall and would have seen the door at the end of the hall that lead into the nursery if not for the fact that Catelyn Tully was standing in front of the door, walking towards her. Ashura's stomach tightened as the other women's eyes light up at the sight of her. She had always felt awkward around the other women, as she was the one who was going to marry Brandon. The noble lady knew that Lauren was Ashura's bastard, and that had set the woman's teeth on edge, but she at least had the courtesy to not say anything about it to her face. But if Catelyn ever learned that Brandon was Lauren's father, then Ashura had no idea what she would do. "Good morning, Catelyn. Did you sleep well?" "I did, well as I could, with it being so cold. I am not sure how anyone could sleep in this cold. The spring water did little to warm my room. I weep for Riverrun. If I am going to be truthful, I am not made for this cold." "You do remember that you are speaking to a Dornish woman?" Ashura jested, trying to ease the tension that she felt in her gut, and she was rewarded with Catelyn letting out a polite little laugh. "Is there anything that I can help you with, Catelyn?" They had bonded closely enough that Ashura felt comfortable enough to simply call her by her name, but that was mainly Elia's doing, not hers. "I was coming to see you, in fact. I wondered if you had seen Brandon anywhere. I cannot seem to find him, and I wanted to speak to him about the wedding." Ashura was so focused on not showing any reaction to when the other woman asked of Brandon that she imagined that she must have looked like something of a simpleton, starting at the air. "Ashura. Oh. Forgive me, Catelyn, I was simply lost in my thoughts for a few moments. It was becoming more and more of a problem lately, that I am afraid that I have not seen Brandon, not since the day before this one. Have you considered going to ask Lyanna? The two of them are so close that I often think that they are joined at the hip. She was the one I went to ask first, but she has not seen him since breakfast when I last saw him. Benjen has not seen him either. I hope that he is well." Catelyn let out a heavy sigh and chewed at her bottom lip for a few moments. "Thank you, Ashura." "It is no trouble, Catelyn," Ashura said with a smile, but the smile fell from her face as soon as the other woman had moved away from her and turned the corner that Ashura had just come from. Ashura felt terrible. She felt like a monster, if she was going to be honest. She smiled at her face while planting a dagger in her back. She had not laid with Brandon since that night at Castle Stockworth, but that didn't stop her from wanting him. She still remembered that day in the stable when she had been tending to Swiftash and Brandon had cornered her, her hand brushing over one his muscular arms before he cupped her face with his hands. They had almost kissed before she had pushed him away. Before he had shown her his true colors. Ashura walked to the door that led into the nursery and pushed it open, stepping inside. Old Nan was slumped in her seat. For a heart-stopping moment she had thought that the woman was dead, but then she noticed that her chest was moving up and down, and if Ashura strained her ears then she could just hear the little old woman letting out some raspy breaths in her sleep. Ashura didn't think she had ever been so relived in her entire life when she noticed that. She had grown fond of the old woman, and if she died then it was a wound that she did not think that Winterfell would be able to survive at the moment. Lauren was sitting in the middle of the room, dressed in a tiny purple dress that matched the grey eyes that she had inherited from her grandfather and aunt and uncles, and Ashura realized that she was glad of that. If her daughter had inherited her father's eyes, then it was possible that Lord Ricard or Catelyn would be able to put it together. The only problem was that she wasn't certain what would be the worst outcome. Her daughter had a carving of a wolf clasped tightly in her hands. She was waving it about instead of playing with it, but she seemed happy. Her father certainly seemed amused by his antics as he smiled down at her. A similar carving of a wolf was held in his hands. He looked up when he heard the door open and smirked at her, and she wanted to claw his eyes out. "Look, sweeterling, it's Mother. Has she come to play with you? What are you doing here?" She was truly trying her best to hold on to her anger. She did not want to scream or quarrel in front of her daughter, but it was difficult as the man was so utterly insufferable. "Do you know that your future wife is looking for you? Perhaps I should go and tell her that you're in here." I hope that you are good at spinning lies quickly. What am I speaking of? Of course you are good at telling lies, as it quite easily explains the trail of shattered hearts you have left in your wake. Why is it that all the women I met are so very dramatic? I've never forced a woman into my bed, and if they misunderstood our arrangements then that is their fault. Not mine. Brandon stood up and picked up Lauren, and Ashura wanted to slap him right there and then, but she did not do that, as she did not want to him risking dropping her daughter, and Lauren looked so comfortable. And if my future lady wife has an issue with me being here, then I will simply tell her that I have come to visit old Nan. Regardless, she has no say in nothing I do. She is not my wife yet, and even when she is, she will have no say in what I do, Brandon said as he strode over to the crib and laid Lauren down in it before he strode to stand in front of Ashura. I'm not marrying her yet regardless. I told her that I don't want to marry her until Elia is back, and father, for once, has agreed with me. Most likely she just wanted to try and convince me to try and change father's mind. She wants to get married. I cannot blame her. It is the only reason that she came here. Now, this has been lovely, but I would like to be alone with my daughter. Ashura tried to walk past him, but he suddenly grabbed her arm and pulled her against his chest. Let me go. I won't. I want you. And I don't just want you like that night at Stokeworth. I want you all the time. I want you to be my wife. Brandon began to kiss at her neck, and Ashura had to bite her lip to stop herself from moaning. Wouldn't you like to be the Lady of Winterfell? Wouldn't that be quite a prize for you? You'd never be the Lord of Winterfell. Your father would disinherit you if you tried to marry me. You'd be the Lord of nothing. That did not seem to dishearten him. If anything, it only seemed to excite him more, and he spun her around so she could look into his face. Doesn't that just sound lovely though? We could go back to Dawn together and just live. I would never have to rule anything. If your family wouldn't have us, then we could go to the Free Cities, and I could work as a sellsword, and we could have a dozen more children if that would suit you, and we could eat oranges every day. Tell me that doesn't sound nice. Brandon whispered into her ear, and Ashura let out a sigh. You bastard. I know. Their lips joined together, and as they kissed, Ashura cried. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33. The grass underneath Jaime's horse's hooves crunched loudly. The rain had been unforgiving the night before, and the sunset sea had been wild and unforgiving the night before, and Jaime had never seen it like that before in his entire life. He would not want to have been a fisherman on the sea that night. Tyrion was riding behind him on his pony, high up on his special saddle that was his own design. Jaime had to admit that despite how much he loved his brother, even he had been surprised by his brother's ingenuity. Even their father had been impressed at the time, and while he had not smiled, he did at the very least seemed pleased, which was almost as rare as their father smiling. They rode deeper into the woods of Lannisport and further from both the city and Casterly Rock. The great stronghold of their family loomed above the city, almost looking like a lion that was about to pounce down onto the city like it was an unaware animal that was practically begging to have its innards pulled out and chewed on. Jaime had to admit that he had never been overly fond of Casterly Rock. He had always been overwhelmed by its majesty, and he had respected the history that it held, not just for his family but for all of the Seven Kingdoms. But that didn't change the fact at night it was as cold as the north, and damp, and air had rushed through the long corridors. The rock was warm in summer and spring, but during the winter it was almost unbearable. Well, he supposed it would be unbearable if not for the fact that all he had to do was clap, and a dozen servants would soon be building his fire and have him buried under 100 blankets if that was what he wanted. There was an unpleasant chill in the air at the moment, but the rain had stopped all through. There was no sign of the sun that morning. It had risen silently and unseen and was now hiding behind the thick blanket of clouds, the color of dirty snow. Jaime would not normally have rode this far away from Casterly Rock for no reason, but he needed to get away from it for a few hours, maybe even an entire day. Ever since he and his family had returned to the Rock from King's Landing with Elia Martell chained with them, he had become a joke, and the stories that the servants and knights of the Rock would not stop spreading stories about what had caused their lord and his family to come back with a Dornish princess, a married one at that. None of them were so foolish as to speak of these things too loudly or to ask any of the family or their guest directly. Most of them could not read, and some of them couldn't even remember to bathe themselves, but they were well aware of how dangerous Lord Tywine was when his ire was raised, and none of them wanted it directed them. But they did not stop the stories, even if they were only told in whispers. In its own way that almost made it much worse. He knew how to deal with a man that mocked him to his face, but not one that spoke behind his back. If they were enemies, men in plate and mail and leather armed with swords and axes and maces, then he would know what to do, but they weren't. They were squires and kitchen maids and stable boys and cupbearers and cooks and pages and lesser lords and ladies, all of whom wanted to bring their lord and his family down to their level a little. To gossip about them gave them all a little excitement in their completely predictable lives. Jaime wanted to stab them. He wanted to stab quite a few things lately. It wouldn't be so terrible if some of the stories he had managed to drag out from reluctant lips weren't so completely ridiculous. The most common one seemed to be that he had fallen in love with Princess Elia at first sight, that he could not stand the sight of her with a husband, and he had decided to kill Eddard Stark by plunging his blade through his heart, and the king had rewarded him for his act of passion by granting Elia to him. It may have been the most common story, but it was also the most stupid one, and only the true idiots in Casterly Rock were the ones to believe it. Another story that was similar and almost as popular and only slightly less stupid was that instead of killing horse-faced Ned Stark, he had instead only noticed how beautiful the Dornish princess was, and his heart had swelled for pity for the lovely maid, and when night had fallen on King's Landing he had scaled a tower that her cruel husband had locked her in and spirited her away from the city with the help of his father, uncle and aunt and brother. It was nonsense. Both the stories worked on the assumption that he found Elia Martell to be a great beauty, and in all truth he did not. She was not hideous, to be fair. Her teeth were white and straight and her skin was unblemished, but that was truly the only kind things he could say about her. Her eyes were a little too close together and they were a dull brown on top of it, her nose was a little too broad and her lips were too thin. The kindest thing he could say of her was that she was not ugly, but she certainly was not a maid that was worth killing her husband for, nor was she one worth scaling a tower for. The prettiest thing about her was her brown hair, which was so dark it was black and fell down to her neck in the curls, but even so that was not enough to call her pretty. And she had not been a girl worth dying for either. Cersei had been. He would have died for her, he'd have killed for her if she had asked for it, and oh, she had asked for it. She had wanted him to take his sword and shove it through Elia's back, to bloody his sword so she could go on with her lovely new husband without having to worry about the princess taking her prince from her. Looking back, Jaime might actually have done that. It would have been better than this. Oh, he might have died to be sure, and it would have thrown all the Seven Kingdoms into war, but at least he wouldn't have to live with the knowledge that right now, in either King's Landing or Dragonstone, his sweet sister, his twin, his Cersei, was most likely laying underneath her dragon prince and being taken again and again, and would soon bear him as many children as he demanded of her. Even the thought of it made his sword hand twitch. It was wrong to think of it, of course, as Rhaegar was prince, but often had he thought of shoving his blade through the dragon prince's heart. He had dreamed about it the night before. He had shoved it all the way through his back and it had come out through the front. His blade had shined in the light and the prince's blood had looked almost back on the shining silver. He had smelled salt and smoke and heard the sound of war drums in the distance, and then his blade had caught fire and the steel of his blade melted like butter in a cookpot, and then the hilt had caught alight as well, and though Jaime knew that he should have dropped it, he wasn't able to. The flames had taken his hand then. It burnt and was terrible, and the smell was terrible and made him want to retch, but he didn't. He couldn't even scream. It was as if he had been frozen, but he still felt pain. He felt it so much. When the flames began to creep up his arm and burn his face, that was when he finally woke up. He had shot up in his bed, pale and sweating, with the sounds of the waves crashing against the stony base of the rock, sounding too much like the war drums from his dreams for him to be able to get back to sleep, and when he did close his eyes all he saw were flames. Still, he was still tempted to do it, but he knew that his sweet sister would not forgive him if he did such a thing, if not for killing her husband then for robbing her of her crown, so he had done his best to clear his mind of those thoughts. That was part of the reason he had insisted on this trip and on bringing Tyrion along with him. He wanted to get away from the rock, and he didn't want to be left on his own either. His little brother was truly the only one that he could actually talk to, as he was the only one who knew. The only who knew the truth. His father didn't hold his brother in the highest regard, but Jaime thought it was a pity. Tyrion was smarter than him and he saw more than most realized. It didn't take him long to figure what he and Cersei had been doing, and when his brother had told him that he knew Jaime had been with his sister in a way he shouldn't have been, he had been terrified of what his brother would do with the knowledge. He had been terrified that he would have told their father. If their father ever found out the truth about him and his sister, then everything would be over. He didn't care much about being the Lord of Casterly Rock, so he wouldn't care much at all if he was disinherited, but he did care about Cersei. If their father found out, then being disinherited and banished was the best that they would be able to hope for, as if anyone found out, then their father would probably kill them to erase the shame from their family name. When Tyrion had told him, he had been so afraid that he had become painfully aware of the dirk that had been hanging from his side. If Tyrion was going to try and tell their father, then Jaime wasn't sure what he would do. He couldn't let him tell their father, but the only way he could think to stop him was to slice his brother's throat open, but he couldn't do that. Tyrion was his brother no matter what he knew, and Jaime wouldn't become a kinslayer, he wouldn't. Cersei would have done it, she would have done it without a moment's hesitation, but Jaime wasn't Cersei. In the end it turned out that he didn't have anything to worry about, and Tyrion wasn't going to tell their father. He had even asked Jaime what the point was, as their father was unlikely to believe him and would probably only think that he was trying to smear Jaime and Cersei in his eyes so that he might disinherit them, and then he would be in line to inherit the rock from his father. Jaime had wanted to tell him that there was no chance that their father would think that, but he knew that what his brother was saying was the truth, and he didn't think that Tyrion would fall for an obvious lie like that. The two of them had then sat down on Jaime's bed and simply talked about it. It was odd to think about it now, but Jaime realized looking back that it was actually the first real conversation that ever truly had with his little brother. He had spoken to him before, of course, but this was the first time that Jaime had ever actually spoken to him like he was an adult, had treated him like he was his equal. They had spoken for a long time. He couldn't remember exactly how long, but he knew that Tyrion had come to speak time him when the sky had turned black and the stars had burned high above the rock, and when they had finally stopped talking it had turned to the color of a peach and the sun was rising. Despite it all, Jaime had not felt tired at all. If anything, he had felt more awake than he had in a very long time. There had been some things that he and his brother had not discussed, things that Tyrion had not wanted to hear and things that Jaime had not wanted to tell him, but afterwards Jaime had felt lighter, had felt better now that there was finally someone he could talk to about it. Since that talk, Jaime and Tyrion had been able to confide in one another more often, had been able to trust one another and get what they both needed. That was why Jaime had brought Tyrion out with him, as his anger and his hate and his frustration and 1,000 other feelings that he had no names for were bubbling under the surface, and Jaime simply wanted to complain out to someone who would hear him and not run to tell his father that he was fucking his own sister. Tyrion was the only one. When he had told his father that he planned on riding out with his brother, Tywin Lannister had not looked pleased, but then he never looked pleased. He had wanted to send his captain of guards along with a dozen other guards to guard them as they rode out, and Jaime had agreed to that. The only problem was that Jaime told his father they were going to Lannisport and not out into the woods. He supposed that it was likely that poor Captain Vlyer was still waiting for them at the Lion's Mouth, not realizing that Jaime and Tyrion had slipped out through the Sunset Gate and rode along the beach and around the walled city of Lannisport, and from there rode into the woods. "Are we almost there? My legs are beginning to cramp." Tyrion's voice cut through Jaime's thoughts, and he looked back at his brother to see him slightly trailing behind. Tyrion could ride a horse well enough thanks to his saddle, and the horse itself was small even for a pony, but riding, he knew, was not his brother's favorite activity in the world, and that it was still painful for him. We shouldn't be far away now. At least he did not think that they were. It had been a very long time since he had been to the clearing that he was thinking of, but he did think that they were close now. The last time that he had been to this clearing was when he had been younger. Jaime had been smaller than Tyrion was now, and his hair had always fallen into his eyes back then due to how long it was. It had almost been as long as Cersei's. His father had told him that it would need to get cut soon, but he never did so for the longest time, simply ruffling the top of his head and laughing. Father did not laugh much even back then, but he did laugh now and then. He smiled a lot more back then as well, but his mother had still been alive as well. His memories of his mother were faint. He did not spend as much time with her as he should have, but she had been busy with looking after Cersei with Aunt Jenna, while Jaime was left to be raised by his father and his uncle once he was old enough to leave the nursery. There were some things that he could remember of her, but most of it was gone. How she smiled, how she laughed, that was all gone. What he could remember wasn't enough. Long golden hair that used to flow behind her like a lion's mane when the wind caught it, and he remember a pair of slim arms then circling him whenever he had been cold or scared. The clearing that Jaime was thinking of was one where he, his sister, his mother and his father used to take picnics on days where the sun shone brighter than any piece of treasure in the Golden Gallery and the sky had been cloudless and bluer than the sea. The clearing was immense, more a small field in the middle of the forest than an actual clearing, and when they did go to the clearing an entire army of servants and knights would follow them, to serve and protect their lord and his family in all things. But as a child Jamie had barely noticed that they were there. He had been spending time with his mother and his father and his sister. Why would he pay attention to anything other than them? His father had used to smile back then. Most of them were for his mother and his sister and his Aunt Jenna, but every now and then his father would have a smile that was just for him. Once Tyrion was born and his mother died, the smiles had stopped like they had never been there. Jamie knew that his mother dying wasn't Tyrion's fault, not really, but even so he couldn't really forgive him for at least being a part of what made their father like this. He was not such a fool as to ever think that Tywin had been a kind man or even a good one, but he had never been this cruel before. He remembered one time he had went into Tyrion's room deep in the bowels of the rock because he had wanted to see his baby brother. The wet nurse had been passed out in her chair at the side of Tyrion's crib, so there was nothing to stop Jamie from going right up to the crib and peering down at his brother. He had been confused when he looked down at him. Everyone had said that his mother had birthed a monster and that was what had killed her, but he did not see a monster at all. The only thing in that crib was a baby, an ugly baby, but a baby. He had reached down and stroked his fingers across his brother's face gently and nearly fell over when his eyes opened, one black and one green, and he stared up at him. Jamie had been terrified that he would cry and wake up the wet nurse and she would tell his father that he had been down here, even though he had forbidden either he or Cersei to come and see their brother. But the baby hadn't cried. He had simply stared up at him with his mismatched eyes for a few moments before he closed his eyes again and went back to sleep. Jamie had tried to leave then, but the door had burst open and his father was standing in the doorway with the face of a man who was about to watch men be hanged from the gallows. His uncle Kevan had been standing behind him with a disappointed look on his face. That night Jamie had been forced to beat his whipping boy for the first time, and every time he had begged his father to let him stop, but the old lion had refused him and Jamie was forced to continue until his arm ached and the poor whipping boy's back was black and blue and was bleeding. Jamie had never seen the boy again and he hoped that the boy had been sent far, far away from Casterly Rock, but he supposed that it was more than possible that he had been forced to beat the boy so hard that his wounds had festered and he had died. It wasn't until later that he had learned that Cersei had been the one to tell their father what he was doing. He had told her that he had planned to go and see their brother. He had asked her to come with him, but she had refused and Jamie had not pushed it because only one person could make his sister do something that she didn't want to, and that day that person and his sister had been of one mind. He loved his sister more than anything, but it was something that he had not easily forgiven her, but of course he did. He always did. After a few more moments of riding in silence, Jamie and Tyrion finally arrived in the clearing, but it had changed. When Jamie had been a child, the grass had been soft and green and it had smelled pleasant. Now what little grass that was left, and there was not a lot of it, had turned to a sort of yellow-brown color and it smelt of nothing. The rest of the ground was muddy and uneven with pebbles scattered about along with a few twigs. A large ditch had formed roughly in the middle of the clearing and it had been filled with rainwater, making a small pond, although its water was the same color as the grass. I must admit, dear brother, this is not what I was expecting when you told me of this place. It has its charms, I am sure enough of that, but I think looking back I would have preferred to go to Lannisport. Tyrion quipped from behind him and Jamie had to resist the urge to knock some of his brother's teeth out, a common urge when it came to his brother, he had to admit. To be true, he found his brother to be very witty, but most of the time he was on the other side of it, watching someone else being mocked. Having to be on the receiving end was never something that Jamie had enjoyed. It wasn't like this before. He muttered as he glanced around the almost bare clearing. He had no idea what could have caused this to happen, and in truth it did not matter. It wasn't as if they could go back now, as their father would not be gentle with them. Jamie was too old to have a whipping boy now, but whatever punishment that his father would have in mind for him would not be pleasant, and for Tyrion it would be 1,000 times worse. In truth he would be punished regardless for lying to him, but they had already gone to the trouble of lying to him and slipping away from the guards he had assigned to them, so they might as well have a bit of fun before they were dragged back to the Rock to face his judgment. And they would be dragged back, he had no doubts about that. By now Captain Vlyer would have gone to his father and told him that they had not presented themselves at the Lion's Mouth as they should have. His father would then launch a short search of the Rock, and when he saw that they were nowhere to be found and that the Sunset Gate was open, then he would send out a search party for them. Assuming that they had only just left the Rock, then they would first search for them in Lannisport, and the city was not small, and only when they found that they were not there would they extend the search to the woods, and none of them would dare return to the Rock without them, as only a fool would want to face Lord Tywin's wrath. So, they had at least a few hours before they were forced to go back. Jaime dismounted his horse and Tyrion followed suit. The two brothers led their horses to the tree line of the clearing that was to the north of the lake and made sure that they were secured to the trees so that they would not run off. The two horses made quite a sight when they were standing next to one another. Jaime's was a war horse, the same destrier that he had ridden in the tourney in King's Landing which had caused all of this mess, while Tyrion's was a pony that had not been expected to survive very long, although it had, and while it could not run as fast as some other horses, not it was it likely to be strong enough to become a plough horse, but it was perfectly suitable for his brother to ride, and that was truly the important thing. Jaime retrieved a carrot from the saddlebag that hung at his horse's side and began to feed it. They would need to find a stream in the woods so that both horses could have a drink before they started back, as he did not trust the ditch full of rainwater, and it was going to be bad enough as it was to face his father. If both horses became sick because of him, then Jaime would have to shovel horse dung out of the stables for an entire moon. Tyrion had just finished feeding his horse an apple, throwing the core over his shoulder, before he turned to face Jaime and addressed him. "So, you wanted to talk to me? What was so important that you couldn't speak to me in the rock?" Despite what it may seem at times, Father isn't always looming over our shoulders. He has his spies that can do that for him. "There are some things that I need to speak to you about," Jaime muttered as he began to unpack the rest of his saddlebags. For a regular horse he was sure that the load would be almost too much to bear, however his destrier had been bred, trained and was used to carrying a man on his back that would more often than not be dressed in full armor with at least a lance in his hands. The horse could handle a few bags worth of supplies. He had brought some food in case they weren't able to catch anything, but he did not expect that to happen. He hoped that it didn't, as the food he had brought was not exactly the most appetizing of fare, as he had to grab it from the kitchens quickly. A few hard biscuits that he assumed had been baked the day before, a few bunches of red grapes that the cook had gotten from the reach, a loaf of bread that had just been baked that morning and Jaime had nearly burnt his hand when he had picked it up. A large wedge of cheese that he didn't want to think about how long it had been waiting in the larders, a pat of butter which had been rolled in salt and wrapped in brown paper, and a few apples. They would not starve, but Jaime had wanted them to catch their own dinner. To that end he had brought with him a spear about 6 feet in length which he could use to get fish from out of the river, and a longbow which he could use to hit the deer and boar and whatever else that would call the woods home. In truth, he was never a great shot with a bow. He could hit a target if it was in front of him, but he was as like to hit a man in armor charging at him in the chest as he was to hit him in the eye. He wasn't overly fond of the spear either, but it was better to use that to try and catch fish than it was to use his sword or his hands. He had also brought an axe with him, but he hadn't planned on using that to kill anything, not unless he counted trees. They would need firewood after all. He finally took a soft blanket that was similar to the ones that they had always used to lay on the grass when Mother was still alive. Jaime unfolded the blanket on the uneven ground, placed the food atop it, and then started to look for any wood that could be chopped. It was unlikely that he would be able to find any dry wood, as it would all be wet from the storm from the night before, but Jaime hoped that he might be able to at least find some twigs and logs that might have been sheltered from the worst of it. If not, then he had brought some small wooden logs from Casterly Rock that would have been used as wood to burn in the heaths that he could use to build a fire instead. He eventually found several sticks that looked like they could still burn, but there wasn't enough to build a fire, so he would have to resort to chopping the logs. Thankfully, near the edge of the clearing there was a stump of a tree that had been cut clean down, which he could use to rest the logs on. He rested the first of the logs on top of the stump and raised his axe high, and with a heavy swing downward split the log clean in half. Tyrion wandered over to him after he had finished feeding his horse and hopped onto the fallen and rotted remains of a tree trunk to watch as Jaime continued to cut the logs as easily as a hot knife would cut through butter. "Be honest with me, brother, the only reason you brought me out here was so that you could show off your wood-cutting skills. They are quite impressive, I must admit, but I think that I would much rather be in my own room right now, curled under my furs with a book as a fire blazed in my heath. Speaking of which, you do realize that as soon as Father realizes that you took that wood, he is going to make us go without fires for the rest of winter." "Well, he'll make me go without a fire at any rate. He wouldn't want to risk you getting sick after all." "Well, if Father does that, you will just need to know how to chop your own firewood. You could learn right now if you wanted to," Jaime said as he stopped cutting the wood and stood at his full height, handing out the axe for his brother to take. "It's a useful skill to have. Even knights need to know how to build a fire, so they can cook and stay warm. Not all knights have a squire after all. You're big enough to hold an axe, why don't you have a go?" "I'm never going to be a knight," Do I truly have to point that out to you? Tyrion said as he hopped off of the rotten tree trunk and took the axe from his brother's hands regardless of his quips. He tested how it felt in his hands and took a few swings before he let out a sigh and handed it back to Jaime. The truth is, I am nothing like you. I will never need to make my own fire or chop my own wood. I won't be a knight and father won't let me leave the rock without supervision, lest I bring shame onto the name of House Lannister. So, thank you but no. Jaime took the axe back with a sigh, but he did not press his brother on the matter. As much as they disagreed and were as different as night was to the day, the one thing that his brother and his sister had in common was that they were both as stubborn as mules. Not that he would ever admit such a thing to either of them, as of course Cersei would slap him for even suggesting that she was in any way similar to their brother, and Tyrion would not look well on it either. He decided not to push it and so resumed cutting the firewood. The clearing was filled with silence aside from the sound of the wood being split by his axe and the sound of the wind blowing around them. Soon enough Jaime had all the firewood that they would need, and so, resting the axe against the stump as he realized that he would no longer need it, and began to assemble the fire. As he was building it, Tyrion spoke up. Now that I think about it, I must admit that I actually am glad to be away from the rock. My tower is quite charming, and sometimes on blessed days it is able to keep the rain out. But I admit I grew lonely. The only company that I can comfortably walk to see is poor cousin Orson and all the other rejects and shames of House Lannister. Princess Elia's rooms are quite close to your tower. She seemed quite enamored with you when you were a baby. It had been a long time since he had thought on the visit of the Martells, but it had never been a pleasant memory. He had liked the Martells well enough to be certain, but Cersei hadn't, and whenever Cersei wasn't happy, Jaime wasn't happy. It wasn't until later why he had learned why she had been so upset with them being there. Their mother and Elia's mother had been planning for them to wed. Jaime's father had put an end to it soon enough, saying that the Martells were too far away to be of any help should they have need of their spears to crush any revolts, and Dorne was one of the poorest realms in all of the Seven Kingdoms and they had no resources that would be of any use to them. His father had put an end to the matter by saying that he wouldn't have his son and heir marry a sickly Dornish girl who was just as like to die before she reached childbearing age, or marry his daughter to a Dornish prince when she should be a queen just because of a childish friendship that his wife and the princess had formed. From what Jaime could remember, that was only one of a few times that his mother and his father had ever disagreed with one another. It was at least the only time that he could remember that they had argued in front of him and Cersei at the very least. It had not ended well. His mother had slapped his father and taken him and Cersei out of the room and locked them all into her chambers. Jaime hadn't seen his father then for close to a week before guards broke down the door and they took her to speak to his father. He didn't know what happened after, only that they didn't fight in front of them again. But the Martells had still been invited to come and father could not turn them away, even after mother had died a few months before they had arrived. It suddenly occurred to Jaime that he had never told Tyrion this story, and yet he didn't seem at all surprised that he had mentioned that Princess Elia had met him as a baby. He looked up at his brother, but he was glancing down at the ground and only looked up when he felt Jaime's eyes on him. "What?" he asked before realization dawned on him. "Oh, yes. Princess Elia told me about this little story on her first night here. I must admit that it was quite a touching little story. I knew that the Martells had come, of course, but not about coming to see me. Why did you never tell me?" "I didn't see the point of telling you. They didn't come to see you. They came to see the monster of Casterly Rock." And that was the truth, at least a part of it. When Jaime had heard that they had wanted to see his new brother, he had been happy. So very few people wanted to see his little brother other than him. Aunt Jenna had sometimes come down deep into the rock to see him, but that wasn't so very often, and more often than not she only stayed for a few moments, let out a sigh and left the room, telling Jaime that he shouldn't stay down here much longer as his father would be angry with him if he knew. She still never told him. When he found out that they just wanted to see if he was really a monster, he had wanted to spit on the both of them and leave them to their wondering, but Cersei had smiled brightly at them and was more than happy to show the monster off. They didn't take them to see Tyrion until near the end of their visit, and every day before that Jaime had tried his hardest to convince his sister to not do it, but she would not be swayed no matter what he said. When Cersei had her mind set on something, nothing could be done or said to get her away from it. Their father had promised her that she would be queen after all, and nothing would change that for her. She would burn all 7 kingdoms to cinders if she could be the queen of the ashes. She wouldn't burn him, never him. He had been quiet when Cersei had led both the Martells down into the bowels of the rock. He didn't speak to either of them as they asked questions about what the monster was like, and Circe didn't tell them anything more than she wanted them to know. Tyrion was crying in the darkness and Jaime's heart broke for his little brother. He knew his cries well enough to know that he wasn't hungry. That wasn't the problem. It was just the wailing of a babe that was deeply upset, and they had followed those cries to him. When they entered Tyrion's nursery, the wet nurse had been awake and Jaime had hoped that would be the end of it, that she would send them away. Of course it hadn't been. The wet nurse had tried of course, but Circe wouldn't hear of it, and with a few words had the older woman running from the room with tears rolling down her face. Jaime imagined that she had gone to tell his father about what they were doing, but at the time he didn't have the time to think about that, as Circe and the Martells were already walking over to the crib. Circe had reached down to pull the blanket away, and for a moment Jaime could remember thinking about reaching out to grab her wrist to stop her, but by the time the thought had crossed his mind she had already pulled it away. Jaime had waited for the screams to start, the cries of revulsion and disgust. He had wondered if the princess would have run out of the room at the sight of his brother, or maybe she would have been sick instead. Jaime had heard that the girl had a sickly constitution, and he had seen at dinners and feasts that she would often only eat a few bits in between rough coughs, and sometimes even had to be taken away from the table by her mother. But neither of those things happened. The Dornish girl stepped close to the crib and looked down at the babe lying within, and her eyes had grown wide and a smile had grown on her lips and a soft coo escaped from her mouth, almost as if there had been a puppy in the crib and not an ill-formed babe. Oberyn had not had the reaction Jaime had been expecting either. He only scoffed and said that he had wanted to see a monster, not a baby. Jaime could have hugged him for that. Circe, on the other hand, had not been happy with their lack of reaction. She had called Tyrion a monster and started to pinch him. Jaime had never heard a baby scream before that. He had heard them cry loudly enough that you might consider it a scream, but it was a world different to hearing a babe actually scream. Elia tried to make her stop, begging her to, but Jaime had gotten to her first and told her to stop it, to not touch him again. Circe had pulled out of his grasp and stormed out of the room before anyone could stop her. Jaime normally hated to see her upset. He hated even more to be the cause of why she was upset, but at that moment he didn't truly care. All he cared about was making sure that his brother alright. He had turned to check on him only to find that Elia had picked Tyrion up out of the crib and had already been soothing him. After a few moments Elia had him calm again and pressed a kiss to his forehead before she had put him back down into the crib. She turned to look at Jaime and had smiled at him. "I am sure that your sister didn't mean to hurt him, she was most likely just tired." He knew that wasn't true. In fact, he was certain that before that Circe had been hurting their brother whenever someone wasn't around to stop her. He hadn't told her that, of course, not that he had the time to, as the door then burst open and his father was standing there with a grim look in his eyes, and all the memories Jaime had of what happened the last time his father had found him in Tyrion's room came flooding back to him. Tyrion coughing brought him out of his memories. "Are you well? You seemed to be very far away." Jaime nodded and returned to building the fire. "And I know they wanted to see the monster. She told me that was all they asked for while they were staying here. But that isn't the point. She told me what Circe did to me and that you stopped her. So, again I ask, why didn't you tell me?" Jaime sighed and didn't bother to look up at Tyrion as he spoke. If he kept focused on the fire pit then everything would be fine. "I don't know, I suppose I didn't want you to know that Circe hurt me. Hates me?" Tyrion asked, interrupting him before letting out a bitter chuckle. "Dear brother, I am afraid that I have known about that second thing for a very long time, and I remember plenty of times that Circe has hurt me. It was not much of a revelation to me." Despite his brother's words, when Jaime looked up he was certain that he saw tears in his eyes. When Tyrion saw him looking he turned his head. "But you protected me, defended me. Just like you always do. I am your brother Tyrion. That's what I am supposed to do." Jaime, despite what his father and sister might think, didn't put much stock in being over-sentimental. He only spoke the truth. It was his duty to look after Tyrion, and it had been his duty since the moment his little brother had been born. "I love Circe, you know that I do, but you're my baby brother. I wasn't going to let her hurt you." Tyrion jumped off of the rotted trunk and walked over to Jaime and threw his arms around his neck. Jaime had to admit that he was surprised, as he and his brother had never been over-affectionate, but he didn't begrudge him this moment, and so he wrapped his arms around his little brother in return and held him tight. After a few moments he patted his brother on the back and pulled away and returned to building the fire. The wood was built up well enough and Jamie found a rock which he struck with his dirk, creating sparks which fell down to the leaves and the wood, and with 2 more strikes from the dirk the sparks finally caught something, a thin finger of smoke rising up into the air, and soon the rest of the leaves and the wood caught. A fire was blazing in moments. Tyrion took off his doeskin gloves and rubbed his hands close to the fire, sighing in pleasure as he was warmed. Tyrion turned and walked back to his donkey and came back with a skin of wine and a pair of cups. He filled one up and handed it to Jamie before he poured himself one and sat down next to the fire. Well, I will admit that I find this to be more pleasant than I would have hoped. I would still prefer a book to read, I think. I was in the middle of reading about the conquest of Aegon and his sisters. This is much better, Jamie said as he took a sip of his wine. It had been spiced with cloves and honey and it warmed him from the inside as much as the fire did on the outside, and what was once a sip became a gulp. You don't have to worry about father finding out that you have a skin of wine, for example. How did you get that? I had a maid go and get it for me. You would be surprised how often that simply saying I am the son of their lord gets me what I want. Father may be a cruel bastard, but at least he has some use. Tyrion drank deep from his cup and let out a sigh. At any rate, that isn't what I wanted to talk to you about. How are you doing at the moment? I imagine that must be difficult. I'm fine, I'm just glad to be away from the rock. To be away from all those fools. Jamie muttered before he took a sip of his wine. He stared down at the red liquid in his cup before he looked up to meet his brother's eyes. How is Princess Elia? I haven't spoken to her since the night we came back to the rock. Tyrion was quiet for a few moments, as if he needed to think before he finally spoke. She's very upset. She won't say so, of course. She hides behind her courtesies like they are more effective armor than heavy plate, but it doesn't change the fact that she is upset. Anyone with eyes and ears and with the sense to use them can see that. To be fair, can you truly blame her? I am the best thing she has for company, and I can't be much of a comfort as I am. Aunt Dorna comes to see her as well, but all she does is talks to her about the Seven and what a comfort that can be in trying times. I love Aunt Dorna, you know that I do, but I can't tell you how many times I want her to shut up. Aside from us all she has is Orson, and his range of conversation topics is rather limited, and Clara and Elia knows that she is a spy for father, or for Aunt Jenna. I don't suppose it really matters. The problem is she's about to burst, a moon or 2 at the most, and she's going to be giving birth to her child in a place she doesn't know and surrounded by strangers. How happy would you be? Tyrion sighed and finished off the wine in his cup before he refilled it up to the rim and took a deep drink of it. That seemed to give him a bit of course as he looked up to meet Jamie's eyes. Why did you do it? Actually, I suppose I know why you did it. The same reason that you truly do anything. Cersei asked it of you. Our dear Aunt Jenna was right. I just don't understand why you would do something so reckless. Even for her. It was better than the alternative. Jamie muttered as he finished off his own wine and held out his cup for Tyrion to refill, and it was a lot better than the alternative. Yes, Princess Elia might be miserable and Jamie wasn't entirely happy either, but as he didn't have to kill Elia as Cersei had wanted, and that had not lead to war with the North and Dorne, so he could live with not being happy, and so could Elia. He had thought that Dornish women were supposed to be fierce. She didn't seem very fierce to him, kind. Yes, he had seen that when they were both young but not fierce. Although, she had been the only one brave enough to speak up to the Mad King when he had commanded that her marriage to Eddard Stark be broken and she was to be betrothed to him. Maybe she was braver than any of them. Not that it had changed much, of course. The king had still forced them apart even if he didn't officially have the power to break apart their marriage. The only thing that even came close to resembling a silver lining was that the king could not officially end the marriage, and that meant that they couldn't be forced to marry one another. Jamie was glad of that more than anything. He certainly didn't want to marry her, and he certainly didn't want to have to be shackled with her child when it finally sloped out of her. In truth, Jamie honestly did not think that he would be any good at being a father. His own father had not proved to be a great example onto him. He had raised him, to be fair, had taught him how to be strong and how to handle anything that might be thrown at him and how to deal with any enemies. But Jamie did not love him. He couldn't. Was it truly? I admit that I am a wretched little imp, so perhaps I simply do not understand, but I cannot see why this is better. This will have angered Dorne and the North regardless. I would bet all the gold in Casterly Rock and all the mines in the Westerlands that the Starks and the Martells are already raising armies to get her back. I didn't spend long in King's Landing, but at the tourney Ned Stark seemed quite fond of his wife. I don't think he will be content to wait for her to be returned." Tyrion muttered as he stared down at his wine, swirling it in his cup. "And what about her brothers? Prince Doran is meant to be a patent man from what I hear, or a craven one depending on who you ask. He might not launch an attack on us, not an obvious one at any rate. But what about her younger brother? They call him the Red Viper, don't they? And from what little I've been able to chisel out of Elia, she was quite close to him, only a year between them it seems. Do you honestly expect for him to do nothing?" Tyrion asked with a raised eyebrow. "And you are the reason we are all in this mess. I know you love our sister Jaime, but honestly, is fucking your own reflection worth everything you might have cost us?" Jaime jumped up from where he was standing, causing the cup of wine he was holding to fall to the ground and cause the wine to spill out and soak into the muddy ground below. Tyrion looked up at him with his mismatched eyes growing wide. Jaime saw the terror in them right enough, but he saw something else as well, a grim sort of acceptance. For a moment there his little brother that he had always sworn to protect and love, even if everyone else hated him, though that Jaime was going to kill him. That moment seemed to last for an eternity, but like everything it did finally end. Jaime let out a snarl and stormed past his brother with his head so full that it felt it was going to split open with the force of it all. He stormed over to his horse. Even the great beast seemed to be unnerved by him, but Jaime paid that no mind. He reached into one of its saddled bags and brought out a quiver full of arrows, and then turned on his feet and walked back to where he had left the bow and the spear and picked both of them up. It was a little cumbersome to carry them both, but he made do. Jaime began to walk into the forest. Tyrion called out after him, but Jaime ignored him, and soon enough his voice faded away. Jaime had explored these woods a lot when he was a child. True had always had a guard or two following him to ensure that he had stayed safe, but he had learned them well enough to know that he would be able to find his way back to the clearing without a great deal of difficulty. He shouldn't have brought Tyrion with him, he knew that now. He might know and understand more than the rest of his family, but that didn't mean that he understood, that he could understand. He should have just come here alone, should have told no one where he was going, and just returned back to the rock when he felt like it. Maybe he wouldn't even do that. Maybe he would just keep wandering until he got lost. He could shave his head and grow a beard, find a town near the sea and go across to the Free Cities and become a sellsword. He couldn't, of course. Wherever he went his father would send men after him and drag him back home. There was little and less he could do to change that. After a few minutes of walking he found himself next to a stream and sat down next to it, placing the spear and the bow to the side of him. He reached into the river and splashed the water into his face, shutting his eyes as he did so. Jaime didn't open them after that, he simply listened in the darkness. The world was quiet here, if only it could have always been like that. But even as all the noise faded away, something else replaced, a scent. It was thick and sweet but unpleasantly sour, as if someone had forced him to eat apple tarts until he was sick and he was now smelling the waste. Jaime snapped open his eyes and reached for his sword without even truly having to think about it. It was simple instinct. He knew that smell. Jaime got to his feet and picked up the bow, slinging it over his shoulder, but left the spear where it lay. He didn't like the idea of leaving it, but he wouldn't be able to hold it comfortably, and even if he could, he had never gotten used to the idea of using two weapons at once. He unsheathed his sword, castle-forged steel which only the finest Lannister smiths could make, and began to follow the scent. It did not take him long to find out what was making it. It had been a doe, but now there was little left of it. The creature was on its side and an arrow had pierced its throat. The fur had been skinned off and great cuts of meat had been cut away, leaving only blood-stained bone. Its head had been cleaned of its skin and crows had been pecking at its eyes and flies were buzzing all around it. All in all it made for an unpleasant sight, and Jaime wouldn't deny that the sight of it caused his stomach to turn slightly, but at the same time the sight did comfort him a little. It was just the remains of some hunters, that was all. There was nothing wrong. In the middle of the woods there were always hunters about, finding what game that they could. He slid the sword back into its scabbard and let out a small sigh of relief. That when the shouts filled the air, Jaime spun and turned around to look back from the way he had come. The voices had come from the clearing. Tyrion. Jaime didn't think, he just ran. He ran as fast as he could back the way he came, running past the stream and only barely noticing that the spear he had left was now gone, and ran towards the clearing. He began to slow as he approached and hide behind a tree which gave him a decent view of the clearing, and what he saw terrified him. Tyrion's pony was dead, an arrow through its throat, and Jaime's destrier was bucking and screaming and trying to break free of its bonds. It made sense to Jaime that they would kill Tyrion's pony and leave Jaime's horse alone, as even someone with little experience with horses would have been able to see that Jaime's was worth more than a regular pony. There were 4 men in the clearing alongside his little brother. The closest one had his back to Jaime and held a bow with an arrow ready to loose if he needed to do so. Nearest to him was a bald man with no hair but with a bushy blonde beard and a scar running from the dome of his head right down to the bottom of his right cheek. It was an ugly thing, pink and puckered. He held a grey iron sword that looked it had been dulled somewhat by use but was still sharp enough to cut. Next to him stood a youngish-looking man, looking closer to Jaime in age than he was to any of his friends, with green eyes and red hair that looked to almost be as long as Cersei's. He held a spear that looked far too familiar, and Jaime kicked him for leaving it. That might have just gotten them both killed. The 4th man was the one closest to Tyrion, and Jaime could make nothing out about him due to the fact that his back was raised and he wore a cloak with a hood which he used to cover his head. The one thing that Jaime could see was that he had a sword, but this was steel, castle forged and sharp enough to cut an imp's head from his neck. Jaime had to move. Well then, what's a dwarf doing out here all alone? These woods can be dangerous, don't you know that? Mind you, maybe you aren't alone. The man lowered his sword so that it was only an inch away from Tyrion's nose, and it took all Jaime had not to unsheath his sword there and then and run right into the middle of it. I can't think of any reason why a little man like you would need 2 horses, especially one that's that big. So, how about it, dwarf? Where's your friend? I'm alone. Tyrion lied as Jaime unsheathed his sword and began to creep over to the man holding the bow, trying his hardest not to make any noise. I'm just rather greedy when it comes to horses, I admit it. I couldn't choose between them. I suppose your charming friend rather freed me of the burden. Do be sure to thank me for him. Now, if none of you mind, I will just be on my way. Tyrion tried to walk off, but the man in front of him pressed the point of the sword into his cheek, and Tyrion cried out in pain as blood began to well around the metal and then run down his face as the sword was pulled away. They say that there is no funnier man than a dwarf, has to learn to laugh, otherwise it'll just cry all the time. You seem quite funny to me, I like that. What I don't like, is liars. There was this girl I used to fuck now and then. She came from the Summer Islands and had the biggest tits that I had ever seen in my entire life. I had the biggest cock that she'd even seen. We got along great. Then, one day I found out that she was fucking my brother. I didn't mind that, it wasn't like I loved her. What I did mind, was that the both of them lied to me about it. So, one night I waited for them to meet in this little cabin, an abandoned thing outside of our village where I used to take her. When they were both inside, I moved these wooden barrels in front of the door and set the cabin on fire. It was actually nice, the screams weren't. Tyrion had gone pale, and that only made the red running down his face stand out more. The man laughed and it seemed to make his entire body shake. Sorry, I know it isn't that funny, but you know what? This was years ago, I was a young man then. And do you know what? I am still here. I haven't been turned into a rat, I haven't been stricken by lightning. The Septons and the Septars like to talk about how wrong kinslaying is, but I've never been punished for it. Isn't that funny? Hilarious. You should go across the narrow sea and become a mummer. They would rain gold upon you, I am sure enough of that. Jaime really just wanted his brother to shut up. They would have his tongue out if he wasn't careful. Jaime was almost in reach of the archer, but not quite enough. If he walked like he would normally, then he would be able to reach him right there and then, but he couldn't risk the noise. An arrow through the throat was to die. To drown in your own blood. He had seen a man die like then when he had still just been a squire for Lord Cricklehaw. It had been during the battles against the Kingswood Brotherhood, and he had been little more than a boy. He had been bright and ready. War had been just one grand adventure to him, and he was going into war with the heroes of his childhood. Barristan the Bold and the Sword of the Morning, and they would crush the outlaws easily. He had been foolish, a foolish little boy who didn't know any better. Lord Cricklehaw had been tasked with leading a scouting party. Jaime had been with him along with his other squire, a free boy, though Jaime could not remember his name, though he would bet gold that it was Walder or something similar to it. That family certainly lacked for originality. It had been a beautiful day, the sun had been high in the sky and the sky was clear. Just the sort of day for the brave knights to go and slay the fiendish outlaws. And then the arrows had flown. Whenever anyone spoke of Wenda the White Fawn they always spoke of how beautiful she was, how tall and fair and graceful with a voice that could make even the hardest of men weep. No one seemed to mention that she was an utterly ruthless bitch and lethal with a bow and killed dozens of men while laughing about it. She was as much a monster as the Smiling Knight had been, but no one wanted to think that a woman could be that cruel, or that a woman would be able to terrify them as much as she had done. It was because of her that she had seen his first man die. He couldn't remember his name. Jaime didn't even think that he knew it. All he knew was that he had been a knight and had been in service to Lord Crocale, and one moment he had been riding alongside them and the next there was an arrow in his throat and he was making noises that reminded him of the time that Aunt Jenna had nearly chocked on a fishbone. He remembered thinking that it would have been funny if it wasn't the worst thing he had ever seen in his entire life, at least at that point. And now that might happen to him. He finally managed to get behind the archer and stood up as slowly as he could to make as little noise as possible. Once he was at his full height behind the archer he quickly clasped his free hand over the archer's mouth and shoved his sword through his heart. He made a grunt but Jaime's hand covered that up and he thankfully managed to quickly disarm him before he fired off an arrow in his death throes. None of the men seemed to have noticed, and if Jaime believed in the gods then he might have thanked them. "I don't know about this one, Ed." The red-haired man holding Jaime's spear muttered as he stared at Tyrion. "Look at those clothes, the gloves. He might be some High Lord's bastard. Do we really need the trouble? I don't normally agree with Rusty, but I think this time he might be right." The man with the scar muttered. He stepped forward to get a closer look at his brother and the one he called Rusty followed after him. Jaime frowned as if Rusty had stayed where he was then he could have surprised him and taken back his spear, which he could have thrown and dealt with one of the men before he used his sword to deal with the last one, but now they were too close together. If he tried to stab one in the back then the other two would see him and kill him before he could pull the sword out of the one he stabbed's back. He wasn't sure what to do. "Gods!" Scar breathed as he stared into Tyrion's mismatched eyes. I think this is the imp. We can all see that he's a dwarf," Rusty said with a laugh, and Tyrion glared at him. "No, I mean it's the imp. Lord Tywin's imp," Scar said with a chuckle of disbelief and fear. "I'm right, aren't I? You are a Lannister." "I am, and I am starting to think that you are beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation," Tyrion said, and suddenly there was a grin on his face and he laughed. "You know who my father is. Do you think it wise to hurt one of his sons?" "Ed, he's right. My pa used to serve old Lord Rain, and when the rose up against him he slaughtered them all. My pa only just got away from it and he wouldn't show his face where anyone could see it ever again." Scar stepped back and Jaime couldn't be sure, but he looked like he was shaking. "We should just let this one go on his way. His friend will be back, son, and if we rob a son of the old lion, there will be nowhere to hide." "Your friend's right," Jaime called out, choosing that moment to make his move. Rusty jumped back and turned to face him with the spear held in his shaking hands. Scar took one look at him and cursed but held his sword firmly, and Ed simply looked at him for a few moments before he let out a little scoff. "If you know who he is, then I think you can make a guess about who I am. You're smarter than most brigands, I'll give you that much. Harm either of us and nothing will save you from what comes later." Rusty and Scar looked at one another but didn't say anything, but Ed simply kept looking at Jaime, his face a blank mask. The mask slipped a little when he saw that the archer was dead, and he raised his sword and pointed it at Jaime. Quite a big speech, from a little boy with a sword that looks like he barely knows how to use it. "I could hold you to ransom, or maybe I could take your brother here. Old Lord Tywin would probably pay us to keep him away." "He might," Jaime admitted, and he couldn't stop himself from smirking and letting out a little chuckle, and he couldn't deny that a part of him delighted at the looks of confusion on their faces. "Shame he ran off into the forest while you were talking to me." Ed's eyes widened and he and his friends turned to look around to see that Tyrion had in fact gone. He had gone the moment his captors had turned away from him. When Ed turned back around he roared and held up his sword. "Kill him. Ed, I said kill him." And that was that. The battle was on. Scar came first and swung his sword at him, which Jaime effortlessly blocked. Scar was big and ugly, but he didn't have an true skill, and he used his sword like a butcher would use a meat cleaver. He had no true skill, and it was easy for Jamie to block all the blows that the ugly man attempted to land on him. The problem became when the red-haired man entered the fray. He had clearly never used a spear before in his life, and that was more than obvious due to his form, but unfortunately he wasn't an idiot. He knew that the weapon he had was at its most basic, a long stick with a blade on it, so he didn't try to get in close. He just tried to stab at Jamie from far away, and most times wasn't even trying to hit him. He was just trying to knock him off his balance so that Scar could move in for the kill. And then finally there was Ed. He didn't just have the finest sword, he also had the skill to use it. He had to have been trained as a master at arms, as Jamie could barely keep up with him. He was a challenge. Jamie had once held off the Smiling Knight, but that was different. The Smiling Knight may have had armor and a fine sword, but he had also only been one man, and Jamie had not even beaten him, just was able to hold him for as long as he could until Sir Arthur Dayne had come to finish him off. This was different. Jamie was outnumbered and wasn't wearing any armor and hadn't been expecting to fight. If he managed to survive this, then he might just consider wearing his armor for the rest of his days. Suddenly, there was an opening as Ed and Rusty tried to get behind him, and Scar lifted up his sword to swing down at Jamie. Jamie dodged to the side as it came down, and with a quick slash cut into the ugly man's middle, opening him up and having blood and guts spill out onto the ground of the clearing. The big man fell to the ground and tried to hold his guts in as he wailed for his mother, but Jamie didn't have time to focus on that as he spun around and brought up his blade to block Ed's next swing, and then had to jump backwards to dodge Rusty's spear piercing his guts. His father's guards couldn't be far away now. They had to be coming looking for them, and when they found Tyrion, he would lead them to the clearing. Tyrion wouldn't abandon him. They had a disagreement and Jamie had stormed off. His brother wouldn't abandon him. He wouldn't. It seemed that the loss of two of his men had unnerved Ed, as he was now forgetting and simply hacking at him, his skin turning red and sweat beading down his neck, and soon Jamie was block his blows with as much ease as he had with Scar. Soon the man was tired and slowing down, and with a graceful swing he removed the man's head from his shoulders, his body crashing down after him. Jamie would have savored the victory if he could, but it was not over yet. Rusty had come close to him and jabbed at him with his spear, and while Jamie tried to jump out of the way, that time he had been too slow and the blade of the spear cut into his arm, and with a cry of pain Jamie dropped his sword and stumbled back, tripping over a root as he did so and falling down next to the stump. Jamie tried to push himself back up, but before he could, Rusty was there. The man had hate in his eyes. He wanted Jamie dead. Any fear he had about Jamie's father looking for him afterwards had abandoned him in the bloodlust, and he pulled the spear back and shoved it into Jamie's shoulder. Jamie had never felt any pain like it. It burned, and for a few moments he honestly thought that he was going to be sick, or he was going to pass out. It was worse when the man pulled the spear out. Jamie couldn't hold back the scream that time as he looked at the gaping mess that had once been his shoulder, blood running down from the open wound like it was a river. Jamie didn't have much time to focus on that, however, as soon enough the man was in front of him with the spear only an inch away from his eye. Jamie tried to reach for his sword, but even the slightest movement in his arm caused it to burn with pain, and Rusty laughed at him before he drew back the spear, but before he could shove it through Jamie's head he let out a cry of pain and fell to the ground, clutching at his leg where a deep and jagged slash had been made into the skin. Tyrion was standing over him with the axe clutched in his arms, his eyes wide as he watched the blood drip off the front of blade. When he saw that Rusty was going for the spear, he did not hesitate. He drew back the axe and with a yell buried it straight into the man's face. Rusty let out a sound that sounded like a mix of a squeal, a scream and a groan as the spear slipped from his nerveless fingers and then fell backwards with the axe still firmly buried into his face. "I killed him," Tyrion breathed as he stared down at the younger man, as through he could not really see him. This was the first time that his brother had ever killed someone, and even Jamie didn't know how to feel about that. "I didn't mean to. He was going to kill you. I just..." "Tyrion, listen to me," Jamie said with a grimace as he tried his best to hide his pain and used his uninjured arm to pull his little brother close to him into a one-armed hug. "He was going to kill me. You didn't have a choice. He could have stayed down, but he still wanted to try. You saved us. Does it ever get any easier?" Tyrion asked as he buried his head into Jamie's chest and shut his eyes, and perhaps it was just because of his small stature, but it was hard for Jamie to ever think of him as anything more than that little boy that he used to shower toys on. Even thought he knew that wasn't fair, and his brother had not been a little boy for a very long time. "You get used to it." That was all that Jamie could say. There were men that enjoyed killing, he knew that well enough, but he had never been one of them. But after a while there was only so much blood that you could spill before you got used to look without seeing. With a bit of luck Tyrion would never have to get that far. I'm sorry that I left you, I shouldn't have. It was my fault, and this isn't your fault. I shouldn't judge you for the actions of a madman. Tyrion glanced around at the bodies in the clearing before looking back up into Jaime's face. Can we go back to the rock now? I think we should get that shoulder looked at. All right, can you help me up? Jaime asked as Tyrion stood up, and Jaime took his hand when his brother offered it to him. The problem was with his brother being so small it meant that he couldn't really pull him up, so Jaime had to lean against him and use his shoulders to push himself up. The movement caused his wound to scream in protest, and Jaime had to grit his teeth to stop from screaming. He had never felt anything like it. They began to slowly walk back over to where Jaime's horse was tied, and Jaime could tell that the creature was still terrified, though it was no longer thrashing around. With Tyrion's pony dead, they would both have to ride back on his horse, which wouldn't normally be a problem as the horse was large enough to carry both of them, but it was spooked and Jaime wasn't sure how it would react to having to be saddled with a second saddle and carry two riders home. Still, they didn't have a choice. They could not walk it, as by the time they got back to Casterly Rock then Jaime's would have already started to fester, and there would be little that the Maester would be able to do for him then. He would be lucky if all that happened was that he lost his arm. In the infection settled into his blood, then he would be a dead man. Though if he lost his sword arm anyway, then he might as well be dead. Tyrion had knelt down next to his pony and was trying to take the saddle off of its body. Jaime would have offered to help, but every time he tried to move his arm it felt like someone was cutting into his arm with a knife, and he could barely move the fingers of his hand without at least causing a twinge in his shoulder. Still, it seemed as though Tyrion did not need him, as soon enough he had the saddle unstrapped from the back of his pony's back and stood up with it in his hands, although it was clearly a little too big for him to hold. It suddenly occurred to Jaime that he wasn't sure how they were going to get the saddle onto the horse. In fact, with his arm the way it was, he wasn't even sure how he was going to climb onto it. Perhaps the best thing to do would be to help Tyrion up and then send him back. He would come across their father's guards surely, and he could lead them here. It seemed as if he would be spared an argument, and Tyrion would argue as he would not leave him alone. As soon enough there was the sound of galloping hooves filling the air, and soon enough men on horseback dressed in crimson and gold armor appeared at the edge of the clearing. Vlaiar urged his horse forward and looked down at Jaime and Tyrion from atop his horse. "My lords, forgive me for being blunt, but what did you think that you were playing at? Your father is not pleased." Jaime might have laughed at the look on the man's face if he wasn't in the worst agony of his life. "Just needed a breath of air, Captain, that's all. Things did go ever so slightly awry. I would love to tell you more about it, but as you can see my shoulder is rather split open at the moment. Is there any chance we could save the questions for my father to ask?" "As you say, my lord." And that was the end of any conversation. The men helped Jaime and Tyrion onto the horse and they began to ride away from the clearing. As they left the woods and Jaime spied Casterly Rock, a feeling of dread settled into his gut. He wasn't sure if it was because of how he realized how far away the rock actually was, and that by the time they got there his wound would most likely start to be infected, or because he was terrified of facing his father. At any rate, they made it back to the rock soon enough, though Jaime's wound was starting to feel hot and swollen and he was beginning to feel lightheaded. They rode through the lion's mouth this time, and all the rock seemed to come out to witness Jaime's shame. When they noticed his wounds, the whispering that he heard grew louder, and the desire he felt to silence it was screaming at him. At least his father wasn't here, nor his uncles or his aunt. He was glad of that, if nothing else. He jumped from the horse as he always used to, but his shoulder burned and his legs buckled and Jaime fell to the ground. The muttering grew louder and Jaime's eyes burned, and he told himself that it was only due to the pain. Soon Vlaiar was there and was helping him up to his feet as two other men helped Tyrion down. They entered the rock and walked so many steps that Jaime didn't even want to try and count them. They eventually reached the Maester's ward. As soon as he saw the wound on Jaime's shoulder his face turned pale and he began to mutter before he turned to his shelves and began to collect various herbs and ointments. "Let us hope that I am not too late, my lord. Help him to the table if you would." Jaime was laid down gently as the Maester crushed and brewed some herbs together to create a thick paste which he soon spread over the wound, and it took all Jaime had not to scream. "Tyrion, he's hurt as well," he muttered. His head felt as heavy as a stone and all he wanted to do was to sleep. The Maester came over with some bandages, but at Jaime's words he turned to look at Tyrion. "I will see to that, my lord, but right now you are more important, so please be still if you could." And with that the Maester began to bind his wound tightly with the dressings, and Jaime wanted to scream as the pressure was put on his wound, but he bit his tongue and managed to stop himself from doing so, though only just. The Maester then brought more of the mixture and spread it on the little cut on his arm as well. "I've seen great men dead from cuts even smaller than this, best to be cautious, I think." The Maester turned and came back with a cup. "Milk of the poppy, drink." Jaime didn't even have to think about it. He opened his mouth and the Maester simply poured the milk into his mouth. Once the Maester was satisfied that his work with Jaime was done, he turned his attentions onto Tyrion. Jaime wasn't sure how long he laid on the table, but he knew that the world started to seem so very far away. The table was not a bed stuffed with goose feathers and covered with silk sheets, but it was comfortable enough to fall asleep on. Before he could, the door slammed open and Jaime's vision was filled by his father's frowning visage. "I am not pleased, Jaime, not at all. Lannisters do not act like fools, and this was beyond foolish, Maester. Will his arm heal?" "It should, my lord." "A pity, a part of me hoped that it would fester. You once told me that the best part of was your sword arm, perhaps losing it would teach you some humility. Regardless, you are lucky that the Maester is competent at his work, and I have no desire to have a cripple for a son." Tywin's gaze was unforgiving and Jaime tried to say something, but his tongue felt too thick and heavy to get any words out. "Did you give him milk of the poppy?" "Yes, my lord, I think that along with the stressful events of the day have exhausted him." And that was the last that Jaime heard. He fell and the darkness claimed him. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34. Cersei felt as though her head was going to split apart. The storm that had raged over Dragonstone the night before had lasted all through the night and had kept her awake until the sun had finally broken through the clouds. She had only managed then to close her eyes, and even then only for a few minutes before she had to awake and attend her duties. She would have stayed in her bed and rise when it suited her, but she knew that she couldn't. Rhaegar had trusted her to run the castle for him and she could not let him down. She missed her husband. He seemed to be spending most of his time now with the Maester and the Castellan, now more than he ever did with her. He would still come to her bed and take her, and she did not mind that. She would never deny Rhaegar, and the pleasure she brought to him was like nothing she had ever experienced. Not even Jaime had been able to make her feel like Rhaegar did, but he never seemed to have time for her in the day anymore. He missed how gently he would speak to her and how in the early days when they had come to Dragonstone he would sit with her and smile. She loved him more than ever when he smiled. Her dragon prince was so melancholy that when he did finally smile for her, then it was more beautiful than the sun, brighter than any piece of gold in Casterly Rock. She missed his singing even more than his smiles, however. The last time he had sang for her was at their wedding feast back in King's Landing in the throne room of the Red Keep. His harp had been high and beautiful just like his voice, and it had made her weep. She had sworn when she had been a little girl that nothing would ever make her cry. She was a lioness after all, and she would always be strong, but the words and the notes had caused her to tear up. No one had said anything to her, of course. It was her wedding night. She could cry if she wanted to. It had truly been the best night of her entire life. Nothing was sure to match it. There had been 7 bards and dozens upon dozens of singers, and food that had been some of the most delicious that she had ever tasted, and so much wine that towards the end of the feast that Cersei could hardly stand. She danced all night until her feet were sore, and then she danced even more with her brother, her father, her uncles, and so many lords and knights, and her husband at least 4 times. The moment she had been taken to his bed had to the best the most joyous of her life. This had been the moment that she had been looking for such a long time. He has kissed her neck and her breasts and between her legs, and when he thrust inside of her it had brought her far more pleasure than Jaime had ever had. When the sun has finally risen she didn't want to awake. She wanted to stay in her dragon's arms forever. But now all those memories just seemed like sweet dreams to her, half-remembered and foolish. She wanted him back at her side. She wanted him to kiss her and hold her and fuck her till she couldn't remember her own name. But he would not come to her, and she was forced to content herself with the pleasure of her companions that every princess must have. Cersei despised the lot of them. The girl from the Riverlands, Jenna was her name, was a pathetic little power grabber and agreed with everything Cersei said without a single thought. Normally Cersei quite liked it when people agreed with her, but the girl was so unsubtle about it that it was clear to her that she was simply trying to gain as much favor with her as she could. Cersei would normally have dismissed her, but she had changed her mind. The girl was so desperate for any favor to benefit her tiny little house that she was willing to do anything to please her. That would have its advantages. Her other ladies were not much better. The ladies from the Westerlands were mostly Lannisters, but all of them were from the Lannisport branch of the family, and Cersei didn't think that she had ever spoken a word to any of them before in her life, and they were all idiots. Cersei could barely stand to hear any of them open their mouths. The oldest was named Lyanna Lannister, and she was the eldest daughter of the Lord of House Lannister of Lannisport. Cersei didn't remember his name, although it was possible that she had simply never cared to learn it. She had spent time in Lannisport, of course, but most of it had been with Jaime. They had wanted to get away from Casterly Rock and from all the little rats that ran around its halls, waiting to take words to their father's ears. Most of the time in Lannisport had been spent in taverns where they had been forced to dress as lowborn so they would not run any risk of anyone noticing them. Cersei had hated it, but she had wanted to be close to Jaime, and when he had told her that she was the most beautiful woman in the world no matter what she wore, then all her frustrations drained away, and Jaime had bought a room for the two of them, and they stayed in that room until it was nearly morning, and they had to go back before they were found not to be in their rooms. Lyanna was going to inherit the large manse in the middle of Lannisport, and her father had never had any sons. Apparently there was some infighting between the Lannisters of Lannisport and the other off-branches of the family that also lived in the city, the Lannis, the Lannits and the Lantels, about the inheritance, as many of them had male sons who could be placed in the line of inheritance ahead of her, but her father had been adamant that only a Lannister could rule over Lannisport. Cersei's father had agreed and had made it clear that Lyanna was the heir to the manse and would soon rule over Lannisport as her father did. Cersei had to admit that when she had heard of that, it had stung. Why was her father so adamant to protect some distant cousin's inheritance right and not the right of his own daughter? Did he not see that she had always been the only one to listen to him when he spoke? She was more his son than either of his actual sons. She loved Jaime well, how could she not? He was practically her reflection, but he did not have her mind. He did not have a thimble of her wits, and Tyrion was a twisted little beast that had killed their mother. Neither of them would be able to rule Casterly Rock like it needed to be ruled. It was always meant to be hers, always. Still, she would be queen now, and that was all that she would need, and when Rhaegar died, which she hoped was when he was old and grey and their son took his place as king, then he would need her help to rule. She would always be the true queen, no matter what anyone said, no matter what some old witch said. Cersei shook her head to rid herself of those thoughts. None of that mattered anymore. She had married Rhaegar, her prince, and the witch had been right about that, but everyone in all the realm knew she was going to marry Rhaegar. She had just been an old fraud who tried to terrify a young girl so she could be rid of her. That was all of it. She turned her attention down to the needlework in her hands, and she frowned at the sight of it. As the best of times she found this to be a complete waste of her time, and as the worst of times she wanted to use her needles to stab someone's eyes out, and with her head still threatening to split open, these were not the best of times. Her ladies made for perfect targets in her mind. Lyanna was sitting on her left, which was often considered to be a place of honor, but in truth Cersei had not paid much thought to it. She just knew that someone had to sit at her left, and if someone had to, then it might as well be a Lannister. Sitting on her right was Jenna, and though the girl had blushed and smiled and had crowed about how honored she was, and it had took all, Cersei had to keep her smile on her face and to stop herself from wrapping her hands around her throat and choking the life out of her so she wouldn't have to hear any more words from her, but she knew that she couldn't. Who would want to serve a queen who throttled her own ladies when they irritated her? Next to Lyanna were her two younger sisters. The elder was called Marianna and the younger was called Lucille. Apparently they also had two younger sisters as well who were too young to leave their home, but Cersei hadn't cared to learn their names. To be truthful, Cersei didn't like any of them. They may have been her kin, but blood was the only thing that bounded them. They were lacking in wits. She had hoped that she might have been able to find something of a friend in Lyanna, due to hoping that she would understand what it was like to have what should have been yours, but the girl did not rail against the injustices that her sex forced onto her, nor did she rage against the treacherous snakes who dared to call themselves her family, offering sweet smile as they sharpened their blades behind her back. No, all she did was smile and talk about how beautiful Lannisport was by the day and how it seemed to come alive at night, and how one of her favorite things to do was sit at her window at night and watch as the great Lannister fleet sailed around the harbor. Cersei wondered if all women were so feeble and she was the only one that was clever enough to see how unfair it all was. The gods did love their stupid jokes. She had learned that very long ago. She should have been born a man. instead she had been trapped in this feeble cage of flesh and taught how to please and sing and smile. It enraged her, and her rage could burn a city to naught but ashes and cinders. The only consolation in all of it was Roriger. Her sweet Roriger made her glad as only as a woman would she have been able to marry him. If she had been born a man then she would never have been able to become a queen, and she had wanted that for such a very long time. But if she had been a son instead of a daughter then she would have been the Lord of Casterly Rock. She was minute older than Jaime, it was hers by right. She would have been the Lord of Casterly Rock, Lord Paramount of the Westerlands, Shield of Lannisport and Warden of the West. Father might never have worn any crowns but he was the king in all but name when he reigned as the Hand. Anyone with half a wit saw that. That was the true reason that he had been dismissed from his position as Hand, not because those vile rumors about the king and Cersei's mother having any truth about them. She might have even served as Roriger's hand and all the realm would knew that she was the true king, and all would beg her favor. But she had not been born a son, she had been born a daughter. She would be the queen that all could see and not the king who would rule from the shadows. This was her lot, but it did not matter. She would still rule and her name would be remembered for thousands and thousands of years. Her father would be remembered as the man who sired her, Roriger as the man who married her, Jaime and Tyrion as her brothers and nothing more. If Liliana's foolishness irritated her then her sisters infuriated her. Whatever small amount of wits that their older sister might possess had not been passed on down to them, as they would often only speak of their dresses and certain men that had caught their eyes. Cersei despised the both of them, and if she could when she was the queen then she would have them both sent to the Silent Sisters. But at least those three were Lannisters. The ones that Cersei hated the most were the two girls from the Reach, distantly related to the Tyrells apparently, but that mattered little and less to Cersei, and she could not remember to which house either of them belonged to, or if in fact they belonged to the same one. They were called Jennifer and Laura, and they were both pretty. If Cersei was forced to admit to that much, but she didn't think that was saying much, to be honest. They were both young and had long brown hair, and every girl with brown hair of a certain age was passingly pretty, but when age took them they quickly became wizened old hags. Cersei hated Jennifer the most, not just between the two Reach girls but out of all the ladies that she had been forced to have attend her. She had been the one that Roriger had called enchanting, and the moment had been burned into her mind. Sometimes when she closed her eyes she could still see her sweet husband saying the words. He had comforted her about it, had said that no one could be more beautiful than her, but it did little to soothe her then, and it did even less to calm her rage now. Why her father had allowed these two Reach girls to attend her she could not begin to fathom. Couldn't he see that they were threats? If Roriger chose to take Jennifer as a mistress, and even the thought of that caused her hands to clench tightly around her needles, and she wondered what the rest of her dear ladies would do if she decided to shove them through her eyes, then any children she might bear would prove a threat to her children, and there could be another Blackfyre rebellion. She could only hope that Roriger wasn't so stupid as Aegon the Unworthy had been, or as mad as his own father. Thankfully he did not seem to be either, and she did not think that Roriger would be so cruel as to dishonor her with one of her own ladies, but even so she could not be sure. She wanted the Reach girl gone. As looked at Jennifer she realized that she noticed a resemblance to someone from her childhood. Melaea Heatherspoon, that was it. It was as if her bedmate had never fallen into that well all those years ago, and she had grown to be a woman. The same brown hair that was so dark that it was almost black as night, and eyes that were near enough the same. The resemblance unnerved her, but it did set her to thinking. Dragonstone was dangerous and treacherous. It was often assaulted by fierce storms and winds so strong that it seemed to Cersei that in truth it would be so very easy for it to sweep a grown man off of his feet and down, down, down to the raging sea below. Jennifer was not a slight girl, to be sure, growing in the Reach with its bountiful harvests and great feasts, but she was hardly near a man in size. The thought of the whole racing down to meet the seas below caused her to grab her hands to make sure that none could see them, shaking with anticipation. "Sweet cousin," Cersei called to Liliana with the sweetest voice and the kindest smile that she could muster. "I wonder if you would mind switching seats with dear Jennifer. I would like to know more of our dear lady from the Reach." The girl did have enough wits not to defy her, and soon she switched seats with Jennifer, although Cersei did notice that she did not look best pleased. Well, it was of no matter to her if the girl was pleased or not. It was not for a princess to please her ladies, it was for a princess's ladies to please her, so that she might consider letting them stay in her service. She honestly did not think she would let any of them serve her when she was a queen. She didn't like any of them, and they were all lackwits. When she was the queen and back in King's Landing she would surrounded herself with beautiful ladies. None of them would be as beautiful as her, of course, and witty as well. though none of the wit would be aimed at her. Jennifer seemed pleased to be able to sit at her side and answer all of the questions that her princess had for her. She had 2 older brothers and she was a daughter of House Roxton. She loved her brothers well, but she had always wished for a sister, and she was oh so very grateful for the chance to serve Cersei, and she hoped so much that she would serve her well. It was pathetic, not as blatant as Jenna had been to be certain, but she was still just another ambitious opportunist, grasping at even the slightest chance of power that she could get her grubby little hands on. Cersei would do well to be rid of her as soon as possible. She asked if Jennifer would like to join her for a private walk around Dragonstone, and the girl gasped like she had just offered her all of the gold in Casterly Rock, and so of course she oh so quickly accepted. A slow smile formed on Cersei's face. As soon as she had accepted the offer, to the door to the small chamber where the ladies were expected to sew until the time came to eat was opened, and Cersei was disappointed. She had been hoping that it would have been the Maester who would come and give her some remedy to deal with this pain in her head, or failing that it might be Rhaegar come to see her, but it was only the servants who had brought food to them so they might break their fast. Cecil had slept later than normal, and her ladies had not wanted to break their fast without her, and so the servants had been instructed to bring the food to them. Like most courses on Dragonstone of late, it was fish. Cersei normally quite liked fish, but lately it seemed as though every single meal was fish. Fish in the morning, feast when the sun hung high in the sky, and fish at the end of the day as well. To their credit, the cooks at least always tried to offer something different with each course, but Cersei was growing weary of it. The stores were running low of anything else, and there were always fish in the sea. Apparently the lowfolk of the grim little island had been demanding that they open the stores to the rest of the island, as it had been a harsh winter for them so far, and while the sea was always full at the moment, few seemed to be coming to Dragonstone. Her husband had given in to them and allowed them some small access to the stores, sharing what they could afford to give. Cersei had not been pleased when she heard of it. She would have answered them with fire and blood and steel, but her husband had made his decision, and naught she could say would get him to change his mind. She hoped there would be something different for their supper tonight at least. She wasn't sure what she wouldn't do at the moment for a haunch of venison, a thick wedge of pork pie, or a few rashers of boar bacon. The fish was medium-sized and a silver-grey color, and it was served to them on a bed of lettuce with a few brown mushrooms that had been cooked in butter at the side. Cersei was served first, as was her due, and she was too hungry to wait for the others to be served, and so with her fork and her dagger she sliced free a chunk of the fish and popped into her mouth. As soon as she popped it into her mouth, she knew that something was wrong. The fish was greasy and it caused her stomach to turn, and with rush of vomit the fish landed on the floor. Suddenly there was chaos. Once of the servants dropped a platter of fish, and older servant with grey hair and sagging teats began to yell at her and told her that she was going to beat her with a wooden spoon until every inch of her flesh was black and blue. Other servants tried to scoop the fish up, while other servants yelled at them to leave them, as Cersei's ladies surrounded her and began to call to her and asked so many questions and began to feel her skin to see if she was hot, and she felt someone began to feel her throat to see if something was stuck in her throat, and the hand at her throat tightened around her neck, and Cersei pulled away roughly, began to scream at the top of her voice. "Out! Everyone out now! And fetch the Maester now!" Her fury was a terrible thing to behold. Cersei had always known that, and her ladies and the servants fled the room at her command. Her stomach was still turning, and her head felt like there was a war drum inside of it that someone would not desist on banging on. She relaxed into her chair and shut her eyes, trying to calm herself. After a few moments of sitting along in the dark, the door was opened and the Maester stepped in. Cersei did not like the man, if she was to be honest. She found him too common, but he had a Maester's chain and she was all that she had to hand, so she would have to make do. He stepped forward to examine her and frowned as she described what had happened to her before a light appeared in his eyes. "My princess, when was the last time that you had your moon blood?" Cersei felt her mouth drop open, and she was half tempted to stand from her chair and slap the man across the face for asking such an impertinent question before it suddenly struck what he actually meant. Her hand fell down to cup at her still flat stomach, and a gentle smile began to spread across her face as she realized that it would not be flat for very much longer. "Go and fetch my husband, now." Cersei did not see the Maester leave, nor did she hear him go, as she simply kept all of her attention focused on her stomach, her fingers brushing gently over it as she thought of the little prince or princess that grew inside of her. She knew that she could do it. She knew that she wouldn't fail. Not her precious Rhaegar. The door opened again, much more violently this time, and Rhaegar was standing there where Cersei looked up. He was breathing heavily and his purple eyes were wide in shock, and Cersei realized that he had run all the way here to her, and that thought caused her heart to swell with love for him. His eyes landed on her stomach and Cersei saw something in his eyes, a mixture of emotion that was made of love, relief and satisfaction. Her prince stepped forward and got down onto his knees, resting his head against her stomach, and began to hum a song that Cersei did not recognize, but it soothed her and made her tired, and so she closed her eyes and listened to her husband sing. She wouldn't let the Wood Witch's words come true. She wouldn't. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35. Elia was still not happy to be trapped in Casterly Rock as she was, but after a time she had found that her sadness had, not faded, to be exact, but she found that she could bear it much more easily now. There were still moments when she felt like bursting into tears, but she seemed to find that the more time passed, the more she found sadness to be natural to her. Like it seemed to be a constant companion to her. She had learned to deal with it, though that fact did not bring her much joy. It warred with her loneliness as to what seemed to control her. She was not truly alone, of course, as Clara seemed to follow her every step, and the only time that she left her company was when she went to go and eat her dinner or when she went to report on her. She wasn't sure if the girl was Lord Tywin's creature of Lady Jenna's, but she supposed in the end it didn't really matter. She didn't blame the girl for reporting on her. She was simply doing as she was bid, and she had only been ordered to be her maid, and she had only been so for a little over 2 moons. She had no loyalty to her, and Elia had no right to expect the girl to have any loyalty to her. Who would defy the old lion or the lioness when you lived in their den and were always at their mercy? The girl wasn't her only companion, of course. Lady Dorna had been her companion as well, and Elia got the feeling that the older woman felt as lonely as Elia did. The woman was not a bad person, Elia was certain of that. Most of the time they had spent together, the older woman spent it praying when she wasn't sewing and imploring Elia to join her. Most of the time Elia agreed, so long as Dorna understood that she preferred to pray silently. It at the very least gave her some quiet. She sometimes brought her daughters with her, but that was a rarity. Serena was not adept at sitting still for long, and she had no interest in needlework, which still caused a great deal of embarrassment for her mother. Her infant daughter was much more agreeable. Muriel was a happy babe that seemed to love being held, and laughter came easy to her, but Elia did not feel the joy that should surely come naturally to anyone when a babe laughed. All she felt was that deep sadness within her growing in its intensity. She had been wondering what her and Ned's baby would look like. Would it be a boy or a girl? Would it have her curly dark hair, her black eyes, her ill heath? Would it have Ned's brown hair? His grey eyes that reminded her of summer snows, or his lips which Elia never loved more than when she managed to convince him to smile? Dorna was smarter than she seemed, as she had noticed that she was upset and had not brought Muriel with her again. The only other companion she had was her babe. It seemed to be moving more and more, and Elia hated it, hated the fact that it was moving, and when she realized that, she hated herself more. She wanted Ned to be here with her, she wanted to have his hand on her belly so she could feel their child move, but he wasn't here. He was 1,000 miles away from her. In her lowest moments, she wondered what he was doing. She wondered if he even missed her. Was he begging his father to raise up armies to get her back, or was he just sitting around in Winterfell, barely even noticing that she had gone? She knew that it was ridiculous. She knew that Ned loved her. He had proven that to her before, but the fact of the matter was that she had no idea what her husband, or her brothers, were doing. Elia had championed patience, and she had not regretted that. She didn't want war. She didn't want thousands of men dying in her name. She didn't want Oberyn to die in her name. She didn't want her husband to die because of her and leave her child without a father. She didn't want thousands of Dornishmen and Northmen to die and be sent back home to their mothers and wives and sisters and brothers and fathers. She truly didn't want anyone to die. Her thoughts turned towards Kevan and Dorna's only son and eldest child, Devan. He was a lad of 10 and was squiring for a knight that Elia had seen around Casterly Rock. If it came to war, then he would have to go with that knight, clean his sword and help him dress in his armor and prepare his meals. And he would be expected to fight as well, and die if needed be. A boy, and men 3 times his age would kill him. Elia didn't want that. She didn't want anything like that, but every day that there was no word about Dorne or the North rising up their banners in revolt, a tiny voice at the back of her head told her that she had been forgotten. She always tried to tell herself that it was ridiculous. Ned wouldn't forget about her, and neither would Oberyn, but the problem was that as much as she loved, it wasn't them that was going to be able to save her. It all came back to Lord Rickard and to Doran. They were the only ones who could command their banners to rise up their forces if it came to it, the only ones who could give them the order to march. Doran was her brother and Elia loved him greatly, but she knew that Doran would not go to war lightly and would only go if he saw no other option. She normally always agreed with her brother when it came to his decisions, but now she was on the other side of it, and while she didn't want war, the fact that her older brother seemed to be doing nothing, not even asking for her back even though it would be pointless, stung. Lord Ricard she could understand more, she was only his good daughter and she couldn't expect him to put her above his people. Her mother had always taught them that a liege lord must always be willing to put the people they ruled over above anything else, even the people that they loved. Ned could implore that his father act, but the final decision would be his. She wondered how much longer it would be until they acted. The babe would not be inside of her much longer. Each day that passed filled her with dread as she realized that she was more and more likely to give birth to it here. And she didn't want that. She wanted to back in Winterfell with the Maester and Ashura and Catelyn and even Lyanna to help her. She wanted Ned to be outside the door with his brothers and his father just barely being able to hold him back from bursting into the room. She wanted to see the look on his face as she handed the babe over to him, fitting it into his arms and watching as he looked down at the life they had created together. She wanted to hold her babe while she was surrounded by people she loved. Elia's eyes burned as she ripped her gaze away from her hands and stared across the room and out the window. The view was as lovely as ever, the sky a lovely peach color as the sun hid behind the clouds, but the sight of it did little to cheer her. Far below, even from where she was sitting, she could hear the sounds of waves crashing against the stone of the rock. It was like the sound of war drums. It almost managed to cover up Dorna's prayers. The older woman was with her today, along with Clara, and at the moment she was reading from the seven-pointed star with all of her attention focused onto the sacred text. The amount of times that Dorna read that book, Elia was certainly that she would have it committed to memory. Gods, Elia probably knew a great deal of it by now as well. She had read the holy book of the faith before, but it was never something she spent a great deal of time dwelling on. Dorna had said that prayer could be the thing that could save you in the middle of the darkest nights. It could offer some light. Elia was more certain that it would be steel or blood that would save her, or damn her. There were times when she couldn't seem to remember what the difference was. Still, the woman was kind and the woman was lonely, and Elia did not have it in her to be cruel to her, and she was only trying to help her, to make her feel better, and so Elia bore her preaching with a smile on her face. Clara seemed decidedly less patient with her, a small frown on her face as she gazed without seeing at a wall. It didn't surprise Elia that the girl was bored. She was young and could have been doing anything at that moment, but instead she was forced to sit in a room as listen to an old woman drone on and on about the gods. It was odd, but perhaps Elia could use that. If she hated hearing Dorna preach, then Elia could invite the woman to spend more time with her. It might drive Clara to ask for a different duty. She did not hate Clara, but that did not change the fact that she was a spy and Elia needed to be rid of her. Of course she would be replaced, but while whoever her master was choosing who would replace her, Elia could think of a way out of this. She could speak to Tyrion without having to worry that the girl would be listening to every word that she spoke to him and would then run to tell on her. Of course that was working on the assumption that her master would care that she was bored out of her skull listening to Dorna pray, and if she was ordered to spy on her by Tywin, then she doubted very much that he would care, or that Clara would be brave enough to complain about it. Jenna might listen to her, but she doubted that the older woman would allow the girl to leave Elia's service. Every time it seemed that Elia had an idea as to how she could find a way out of this terrible ordeal, it always seemed that she thought of something that made her realize that there was something wrong with her plan, or that the plan wouldn't truly matter in the end. She could think of a way to get out of Casterly Rock easily enough, but so far the best plan she had thought up only ended with her getting as far as Lannisport. She could try to hide in the walled city, but she had no friends there, and when Tywin Lannister came looking for her, there was no one that would hide her then. She was so very weary of all of this. Most days all she wanted to do now was stay in her bed and sleep. Not that her wish was ever granted to her, as Clara always bid her to rise. When she wasn't forced to sit and sew and pray, she was often invited to sit with Lady Jenna and her ladies. She had noticed that most of Jenna's ladies and her maids were closer to their lady in age, and that made Elia think that Clara was in fact Lord Tywin's creature, as if Jenna had sent her. Then Elia imagined that she would have been older. Tyrion would often come and sit with her, and he was capable of making her laugh, a rare feat now it seemed. Still, aside from making her laugh, there was little that he could do to truly help her. He could order servants to bring them wine or something to eat if they were hungry, but that was the limits of his powers. He could hardly order them not to tell his father what they were speaking of. They would do it regardless, and Tyrion would have to suffer the consequences of that. She seemed a small boat, in the middle of a storming sea, at the mercy of the seas and the winds, and all she could do was try and keep herself together while greater forces than her decided her fate. Perhaps she would remain a prisoner in Casterly Rock for the rest of her days and grow to an old maid. Her child, who would have the blood of Queen Nymeria and the kings of Winter, would be forced to serve as a common household knight if he was a boy, or be forced to wait on a lady if she was a girl. Elia couldn't let that happen. She would not let that happen. The only problem was that she had no idea what she could about it. Elia kept her gaze out through the window, and the sound of the crashing waves and the sound of Dorna reading from the book started to sound much the same as each other. In its own way it became quite soothing, and she felt herself beginning to tire. It was rude to fall asleep when someone was speaking, of course, but if Dorna noticed, which was unlikely as she never noticed when Clara fell asleep, which was almost every time, she could just blame it on the babe tiring her. Just as she was about to slip off of the cliff edge and fall into the darkness of sleep, there was a sharp rap on the door of her room, and that jolted her awake. Clara rose to her feet, and Dorna stopped reading from the book as the younger woman made it to the door and opened it so she could peer outside to see who had knocked. Clara turned to face her. "It is Sir Jaime, Princess. He asks if he might come in." Elia nodded before she rubbed at her eyes to try and wake herself some more. It would do no good to appear tired. Clara pulled the door open all of the way so that Jaime could step through. He seemed paler than usual and smaller as well. She supposed that it was to be expected after a man was wound. His shoulder and arm were still wrapped in layers of white silk and were tied in such a way that his arm was pressed close to his chest, to restrict the movement that he was allowed. The Maester had said, as he was worried that free movement might worsen the wound and cause it to fester, and if that happened he would have no choice but to remove the entire arm at the shoulder. Tyrion had been wounded as well from his and Jaime's little adventure, a small puckered wound that had resulted from when he had been poked hard with his brother's spear when it had been stolen from Jaime by a robber. The wound had since scabbed over, and all that was left of it now was a tiny white scar on the dwarf's face, about the size of a copper. Tyrion said that it made him more handsome. Elia hadn't been able to stop herself from laughing at that. It felt good to know that she could still laugh, even if the thing she laughed about wasn't truly very funny. It had been the closest to happy that she had felt in a very long time. "Jaime, I am so glad to see you up and about," Dorna said with a bright smile as she closed her book and stood up, pressing a kiss to both of his cheeks, which Jaime accepted with surprising grace. "We've all been praying for you to recover. Are you feeling better?" "I am, Auntie, thank you," Jaime said as he ducked his head and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek, though it seemed more dutiful than out of any actual affection. Jaime pulled back from the older woman and he turned his gaze onto Elia. To her surprise, she saw something in the younger man's eyes that she had not seen before. It almost looked like regret. "Alas, Auntie, is not you who I have come to speak to?" "Princess, I wonder if we might speak alone for a moment. Perhaps you would be so kind as to join me for a little walk." "Just you and I?" Elia frowned, trying to think of any reason why Sir Jaime would wish to speak to her and not being able to think of one. Their last conversation had not ended well and had just left her with more questions. Still, she couldn't say no to him. That was the tricky thing about being a captive. Even if the people holding you were just as unhappy to have you and you were unhappy to be had. So Elia pushed herself up from her chair, keeping one hand on her bump as the movement seemed to have roused the babe somewhat, and painted a smile on her face. "I would enjoy that a great deal, Sir Jaime. Do we have a destination in mind, or shall we simply wander?" To give Jaime some credit, he was at least smart enough to realize that Elia did not seem at all happy with going with him, but he did not rescind his invitation either. Clara asked her if she would like her to accompany her, but it was Jaime who answered by telling her that she would not be needed. Dorna happily said that Clara could stay and pray with her, and the girl looked like she would be more happy having her tongue removed with red-hot piercers. Jaime offered his hand and Elia took it with as much grace as she could muster. It was hard to be graceful when you were tired. Not just tired as in she wanted to fall onto her bed and sleep, but tired of everything, tired of waking up. Tired of eating, tired of breathing. The way her thoughts had been going lately, it scared her beyond any measure, and she sometimes wondered that if it weren't for the babe that was growing inside of her. She couldn't think like that, she wouldn't allow herself to. She rubbed at her eyes quickly and shoved that thought to the back of her mind, refusing to dignify it by giving any more thought to it. Sir Jaime led her through the long and high corridors of the rock. Every now and then there was a gust of cold wind that caused the flames of the torches to flicker and throw long shadows and caused Elia to clutch her cloak closer to herself to try and shield herself from the worst of it. It was odd, she had never felt cold in Winterfell. Oh, when she had first come to the north she had been freezing and she had been terrified that Winterfell would bleak and cold and grim and there wouldn't be a moment where she was not sick, but she had never been cold in Winterfell, not if she didn't want to be. Water from the springs underneath the great castle had been carried around the castle through pipes like blood had been carried through a man's body by his veins. Winterfell had never been unwelcoming. And in her mind, that made it greater than Casterly Rock could ever hope to be. She wanted to see it again. She didn't want this cold and gloomy place to be the thing that she would see for the rest of her life. Elia was brought out of her thoughts when she and Jaime had taken a different turn than normally. It would seem that it would take them away from the surface and deeper into the rock. Well, I must admit that this is something new to me. I have never truly felt the urge to explore the rock before, not that I have had many opportunities to do so. She tried to sound more interested than she felt, but she was fairly certain that she could not quite manage it. Sir Jaime seemed to notice as well. A small frown had found a place on his face and Elia noticed that it seemed almost unnatural. His was not a face that was made for frowning, but, and although it was petty and cruel of her, a part of her couldn't help but indulge in his sorrow. His actions had brought great sorrow onto her. It was only fair that he had his own little sorrow as well, even if it was only just because he had lost the use of his sword arm for a while. I am sorry, Jaime said, and his voice brought Elia out of her spiteful thoughts and she turned to look at the man walking next to her, and now that she looked at him, truly looked at him, she could see the truth of it. The look on his face was shame. He was ashamed. I knew that I said I would not apologize for what I did, but I was wrong. I am sorry for what I did. I can't explain why I did it, you wouldn't understand, but I am sorry. I didn't mean for you to be separated from your husband, that wasn't meant to happen. Elia honestly had no idea what she was to say to that. The last time she had spoken to the older Lannister brother he had seemed utterly unrepentant about what he had done. He had almost acted like he had done it for her. She had given up trying to figure out why he had done it. It was certainly not because he was in love with her, he had admitted to that much. A part of her thought that it had just been a fit of madness, and for a moment she remembered the stories that had gone around the kingdoms about the Lady Joanna and the king. It suddenly struck her that they had come to a stop in the passageway and were staring at one another, Jaime Lannister staring into her eyes. Elia brought up her hand to her mouth and cleared her throat. Well, I thank you for apologizing to me, Sir Jaime. It is very kind of you, but in truth there is no need. You did not mean for this to happen. Regardless, I do appreciate it. I forgive you. No, you don't. You don't forgive me. You are still angry with me. A part of you might even hate me. Elia opened her mouth to respond. She didn't know if she was going to deny it or if she was going to scream at him, but before she could, Jaime held up his hand and she closed her mouth. Don't deny it, princess. I may not be the smartest man in the realm, but I assure you I am not so much the handsome fool as everyone seems to think. I do not expect you to forgive me, that wasn't the point. I just wanted you to know that. Well, now I do. Now I know that you are sorry for what you have done to me. For ruining my life. Elia was surprised at the bitterness that filled her words and how exhilarated she felt when she saw the shame on Jaime's face grow. Now that I know, might I be allowed to return to my room? I suddenly find myself to be quite tired. It may be that I am taking a turn. No, not yet. There is something that I want you to see first. Jaime offered his arm and Elia took it with a sigh. It wasn't courteous, but she found that she didn't have the energy to keep her armor up anymore. I promise that as soon as you see this you may return to your rooms, but I think you will be surprised. A silence fell on them then. Any words would simply be uncomfortable talk with no real point to it, and before too long they arrive at two large wooden doors that had splintered with age. Sir Jaime reached out with his free hand and grabbed at the iron ring with his free hand and pulled with all the strength he had. Unfortunately, while the door opened a crack, it did not fully open and Elia had to help Jaime in finally getting it open, though it tired them both. When Elia gazed through the open doorway, her breath was stolen from her lungs and she barely felt her legs carrying her through into the chamber beyond. It was a large chamber that was the shape of an egg and it was made purely of grey stone. There were no windows and the only light that came was from the torches that lined the outside passageway. Even with that limited amount of light it did not strain her mind to see that the large tree in the middle of the chamber was a weirwood tree. It was not so large as the one back in Winterfell's goatwood, but it was by no means a small tree. Its wood was pale, even paler than usual, but Elia imagined that was due that there was little light that it could drink down here. Its roots were massive, as large as lesser trees' trunks, and while some burrowed into the earth, some had crawled towards the doorway while others were climbing the walls. Almost as if it was trying to escape. "What is this place?" she whispered as she stepped towards the tree, taking care to step over the roots and piles of red leaves that had been laid about. Her voice had been a whisper, but the chamber had made it sound like she had shouted it at the top of her voice as her question echoed all around her. In truth, she did not need it answered. There was a face carved into the weirwood's trunk. It was a heart tree. This was a god's wood. "This is the stone garden, this is the god's wood," Jaime said as he stayed near the door. He sounded uncomfortable, which Elia could understand. She had felt uncomfortable when she had entered the Winterfell Godswood. It was as if the old gods hadn't wanted her there. She had been more than happy to stay out of it after her words had been said and her marriage to Ned complete. Elia sat down on one of the roots. It was so wide that she could lay on it like a lounger and stretch out her arms, and her fingers would only just barely go over the sides, and stared into the carved face which was weeping its red tears. It was odd, but she did not feel uncomfortable here, or not as uncomfortable as she had been in Winterfell. Perhaps the old gods had accepted her, perhaps they were showing her some mercy because she was carrying a Stark within her, or perhaps what the Northerners said was true. The old gods had no true power here. Most of the weirwood south of the neck had been cut down or burned. "It is beautiful, but I do not worship the old gods," said Jaime. "I do not understand why you have brought me here. Most south of the neck don't. Poor Auntie Dorna has begged my father to get rid of this place. She said it will bring the wrath of the gods down on us, but he doesn't listen to her. We would have to rip up the stone, and who knows how far down the roots go. But no one ever comes here, no one. I thought that it might be a place you could come where you might have some peace." Jaime glanced down at his feet. A place where you could think. It was such a simple gesture, such a sweet gesture that it took all Elia had not to break down weeping. She turned her face away from Jaime and closed her eyes. All she could hear was her own breathing and the sound of the waves rolling into the water caverns far below. It sounded like thunder. It was so peaceful, and for a moment, she realized something. She could finally breathe. That finally brought tears to her eyes. She didn't know how long she sat there. She prayed, though not to any god in particular. All she did was pray that she would see Ned again, that she would be home before her babe was ready to be born. She stood up from the root after letting out a deep breath and opened her eyes before she turned to look at Sir Jaime, stepping towards him. "You were right, I did not forgive you. I do not forgive you, I can't. Not yet." Sir Jaime did not seem hurt. He seemed resigned, as if he knew that this was what she was always going to say to him. "But this was a great kindness to me, Sir Jaime. And I promise you, I will not forget it." Elia leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to Jaime's cheek. She could feel the beginning of blonde stubble under her lips. As she pulled back, Elia saw something that she hadn't seen before. She saw Jaime Lannister smile. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36. Doran sat in his wheeled chair behind the desk of his solar in the water gardens. A pitcher of clear water and a pitcher of a sour red which he was quite fond of perched atop his desk. Alongside them was a small bowl filled with olives and a plate filled high with flatbreads which were coated with black pepper and glazed with golden butter. A personal favorite of his, and he would have to remind himself to thank the cook for them. He also had various fruits scattered about in bowls. Oranges and pomegranates and lemons and figs, for which the noble lords and ladies that he played host to could nibble on at their leisure. Doran never normally held court in the water gardens. That was not the point of it. It was a leisure palace, a place to come and rest and forget their duties for a time, a place where their children could simply be children. But all of that had seemed to change lately. Now the pools were empty and no one seemed to laugh anymore. Men armed with spears and glaives and curved swords and shields patrolled for all to see, more than there had ever been before. He had to send for Solidus from Sunspear. The water gardens had never been a prison, and yet circumstances had forced it to become such. He had considered sending his brother, his daughters, and the men his brother had recruited to his fool cause to Sunspear. They would be just as comfortable there and even more secure than they were here. The problem was that the amount of people that needed to be transported to Sunspear was not inconsiderable, and it was likely that Oberyn could slip away when no one was looking, and Oberyn turned loose with nothing to keep him in check was as dangerous as he was unpredictable. Even if he personally assigned guards to keep watch on his brother while the host was moving to Sunspear, that wasn't a certainty that his brother wouldn't be able to escape. Oberyn was a charmer. Everyone in Dorne loved him, and he was extremely easy to love, as their mother had used to say. Doran knew the truth of that well enough. For all the headaches and heartaches that Oberyn had caused him over the years, he was still his brother and he loved him greatly. The problem was that it wouldn't take his brother much to convince a guard to let him slip away. Doran did not doubt his men's loyalty to him, but he also didn't doubt how persuasive his brother could be either. The only man he was certain that Oberyn could not charm onto his side would be Aero, but he would loathe to send him away that far even for a short amount of time. There was no one in the world he trusted more than Aero. The only one he could trust to keep his secrets and keep him safe. The bearded man was standing in the corner of his room, using a whetstone to sharpen the blades of his great axe. Always willing and eager to serve, Doran didn't think that Aero would be needed, and he certainly did not intend for Aero to have to use his great axe, but Aero was an intimidating-looking man, and that could come in handy in its own way. When he had taken the lords his brother had brought to him into his hospitality, he knew that he would have to deal with the consequences of that action, though in his head he knew it was the right choice, even though his heart seemed to be in disagreement. He thought of his sister. He had been about 9 years of age when Elia had been born, and he had tried his hardest not to get too attached to her. She had been born almost an entire moon too early, and it seemed certain that she was going to die, just like Mors had, just like Oliver had. But Elia hadn't. She refused to die and just kept on going. Despite Doran trying his best to not get attached to his sister, certain that she was going to die for such a long time, and the Maester had been in agreement about that, warning Doran's mother that she was still very frail, and it had seemed that Mors and Oliver were going to live as well before they had both turned. But for every day that her heart kept beating, Doran found it harder and harder to resist, and before too long he had found himself loving her. And just in time as well, as soon enough he was being sent away to squire for Lord Gargallan at Saltshore. He was glad that none of the Gargallans had been foolish enough to follow Oberyn in this, though it was just as likely that Oberyn hadn't even bothered to go to Saltshore, as old Lord Gargallan was still alive and looked likely to bury them all, and he loved Doran like a son. He wouldn't rise up his spears against him. He had left for Saltshore the day that Elia had learned to say his name, and a year later a letter arrived on black wings, but the words only brought him more joy. A new babe had been born to his mother, and that new one was a brother. He wasn't going to see him for a while, as he still had to continue his duties as a squire, but close to 9 years later he was finally allowed to return to the Water Gardens. He remembered expecting that his brother would perhaps be a little bit more like him. He certainly was not expecting to find a boy that dashed through the pools of the Water Gardens like he was a water snake and be able to take down boys that were twice his size. He had been nothing like Doran had been. Most of his time had been spent inside reading books, to better learn how to rule. It had been Elia who had finally been able to bring them together. Oberyn had found him too boring when their mother had finally introduced them to one another and had ran off back outside to play in the pools once again. Elia had been closer to Oberyn, which made sense as she was only a year older than Oberyn and they had spent all their years growing with one another, but she did know Doran as they had been writing to one another as long as he had been squiring at Saltshore. Through her they had formed a bond as brothers should have, though it still grieved him that he was never as close to either of his siblings as they were to one another, though there was little that could be done about that now. Elia had always been helpful. Oberyn had worshipped Elia, and through her he had always been easy for Doran to keep in check, to control. Now that Elia was gone, it was only Doran that could deal with him, and with each day that passed he was uncertain how Elia had been able to handle him, not to mention his daughters. They were proving to be just as big pains as their father was, but he couldn't help but love. Elia was better with them. Elia was always good with children. It did not matter if they were Oberyn's or his, lowborn or highborn, baseborn or true. She always seemed to understand them. He had always thought that she would make a wonderful mother, and now he would see the proof of that. When news had reached him that Elia was with child, he didn't think he could be happier, but his happiness had only lasted for a few scant moments when the next few lines in the letter spoke of the Mad King's declaration for her marriage to be dissolved and for her to be betrothed to Sir Jaime Lannister of Casterly Rock, heir of Lord Tywine Lannister, Lord of House Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock and the Shield of Lannisport. It was a fine match to be certain. one that any prince could be proud of, and it had been the one their mother had truly wanted for her daughter all those years ago, and it had only been the pride of the old lion that had stopped it from coming to pass. And Doran perhaps would be happy with it, if only it was possible for them to marry, which it was not. It was a betrothal commanded by the king who could not be denied, and had no future when the wife was already married to a different man and with that man's child. He still remembered the rage that threatened to consume him when he read the words that said that the king had callously ordered his sister to drink moon tea if her being with child was an impediment to being betrothed to Sir Jaime. The Mad King was smarter than he seemed. He knew that Elia would not do that. No high-born lady, no princess would ever wash away a true-born child of their husband. There would be no need to. And if he knew his sister as well as he thought he did, then he knew that Elia would have loved the child growing inside of her the moment her blood had stopped and her body had started to swell. His heart hurt to think of her trapped at Casterly Rock, but there was little that he could do about it, not yet. Oberyn would have him raise up all of Dorne and send all the spears that was past the Red Mountains to bleed and die and suffer for Elia, and he knew that Elia would not want that. She would never want anyone to suffer in her name. Oberyn was still young, and there were things he still did not understand about Dorne, for all he claimed to know. He would have to see that his brother was educated in the